The Middle Pillar, The Balance Between Mind and Magic, by Israel Regardie. Introduction to the third edition. In the early decades of this century, little was known about the techniques of Western ceremonial magic due to the veil of secrecy which had shrouded these practices. Unless a person happened to be a member of a magical organization, there was little chance of learning the procedures and initiatory practices of high magic. This changed in 1937, when Israel Regardie published 4 volumes titled The Golden Dawn, a collection of ceremonies and teachings from the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. Earlier, Regardie had published 2 books describing the magical principles of the Golden Dawn system. The Middle Pillar, published in 1938, gave step-by-step details on how to perform practical exercises of ceremonial magic, something which was quite revolutionary for its time. Perhaps even more radical was Regardie's daring attempt to correlate these magical techniques to the then new methods and hypotheses of psychoanalysis. Since the object of study in both magic and psychology was the human mind, it was Regardie's belief that magic could be regarded as a subdivision of the science of psychology. Such a thing was quite unheard of in 1938. In fact, Regardie postulated that psychotherapists could use the techniques of magic, such as the lesser banishing ritual and the middle pillar exercise of the Golden Dawn, in a clinical setting for the benefit of patients. In the mid-1930s, Regardie's suggestion would have raised many eyebrows, but today several enlightened therapists are coming to the conclusion that the magicians of old were the psychotherapists of their day. Over the last few years, there has been considerable reconciliation between occultism and analytical psychology. A large percentage of ancient magical knowledge is being rediscovered and renamed by modern psychologists for modern times. The gods and angels of magic are described by the science of mind as archetypes, while demons have been converted to neuroses. The goal of both magic and psychotherapy is the well-being of the individual, his or her growth and health on every level, physical, mental, and psychological. Magic, however, also includes spiritual well-being. Regardie sought to tear down the artificial walls that had been built up between the ancient art and the modern science. Regardie's The Middle Pillar was a milestone which boldly stated these ideas long before they became popular. Today, the exercise of the Middle Pillar as a technique for self-development has become standard fare, so much so that it is sometimes described in New Age self-help manuals, often without mentioning its source in the Golden Dawn tradition. The Middle Pillar shows the clarity of writing, expertise, and love for teaching that Regardie was famous for. To this day, it remains a classic among magical texts. Who was Israel Regardie, and why did he write The Middle Pillar? The following brief biography should give readers an awareness of Regardie's prominent place in the history of modern magic and occultism, as well as his interest in psychology. Before his death in 1985, Israel Regardie was considered by many to be the last living adept of a prestigious magical current known as the Golden Dawn. The tradition represented by the Golden Dawn and its sister spin-off groups, the Stella Matutina and the Alpha et Omega, attracted many influential occultists of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Among these were Dr. William W. Westcott, Samuel L. McGregor Mathers, Arthur Edward Waite, William Butler Yeats, Dion Fortune, and Aleister Crowley. Yet among this extraordinary ensemble of knowledgeable magicians, Regardie ranks high as an authority of prominence. Born on November 17, 1907, in London, Israel Regardie moved with his family to Washington, D.C. in 1921 when he was 13 years old. At an early age, he developed an interest in the theosophical works of Madame Blavatsky, Hindu philosophy, and yoga. At age 16, Regardie frequented the Library of Congress, which he called his second home. It was through his contacts in the library that he was able to find a Hebrew tutor. He learned to read Hebrew fluently, a skill that would aid him tremendously in his study of Kabbalah. About this time, Regardie enrolled in an art school in Philadelphia. On March 18, 1926, Regardie discovered a newly published book which captivated his curiosity. The book was Part 1 of Book 4 by Aleister Crowley. Regardie wrote to Crowley in Paris and eventually received a reply to his inquiry, suggesting that he contact Crowley's agent, Carl Germer, in New York. From Germer, Regardie bought a set of The Equinox, a series of magazines that Crowley published from 1909 to 1914. This was the beginning of Regardie's lifelong interest in magic and mysticism, which changed the course of his whole life, and he soon realized that art was not his calling. In March of 1926, the young Regardie became a member of the Washington College of the Societas Rosicruciana in America. A year or so later, Crowley offered Regardie a job as his secretary in Paris. Regardie took this as a great opportunity to learn magic from an authority. In order to go to Paris, Regardie had to obtain a passport and a visa. He was still a minor and was supposed to get permission from his father for the required documents. However, he never told his parents about Crowley or his interest in mysticism. Crowley received a great deal of bad press in both the English and American tabloids, so Regardie was hesitant to tell his parents that he would be working with Crowley. Since Regardie had attended art school, he simply told them that he had been invited to study painting with an English artist in Paris. His parents gave him documents for the passport, but when it came time to obtain the French visa, Regardie typed up the papers himself and signed his father's name to it. So in October of 1928, at the age of 20, Regardie went to France to take the post that Crowley offered him. For the next 3 years, Regardie lived a rather nomadic life as he tried to get his employer to teach him the magical arts. However, Crowley did not offer to teach Regardie magic or yoga, and Regardie, a shy and unobtrusive young man, did not press the issue. Instead, he continued his own studies, reading every book or manuscript on these subjects that he could get his hands on. Meanwhile, Regardie's sister, whom he scornfully referred to as Nosy Parker, read some of Crowley's books, and since she understood nothing about magic, was appalled. She marched off to the French consul in Washington and complained about her brother's demise. The French consul promised to look into the matter. This was the beginning of trouble. 4 months after Regardie arrived in Paris, a French detective from the Sûreté Générale came to the apartment to see what kind of wicked monster this man Crowley was. It just so happened that Crowley owned an unusual glass Silex coffee maker that the detective assumed was used for distilling drugs. The fact that Crowley was the British head of a German magical society, the Ordo Templi Orientis, led police to the false conclusion that Crowley was a German spy. Crowley's problems came to a head when he had a falling out with his literary press agent, who told French police that Crowley was a drug addict. As a result of all this, Crowley and his wife-to-be, Marie de Miramar, were given expulsion papers. The young Regardie, who had neglected to get a valid residence permit, was also told to leave the country. After spending 6 months in Brussels, Regardie went to England, where he stayed with Crowley and his wife. By the time Crowley had discovered another publisher, Mandrake Press, but by now Crowley's notoriety in the tabloids as the wickedest man in the world was enough to cause most booksellers to avoid him, and Mandrake Press soon went under. As a result, Crowley could no longer afford to keep his secretary. After attempting to repair Crowley's tarnished image by co-authoring a book called The Legend of Aleister Crowley, 1930, Regardie and Crowley drifted apart, though they remained friends. For a time, Regardie, who had settled in London, served as a secretary for Thomas Burke, the novelist. In 1932, Regardie published his first two important books, A Garden of Pomegranates and The Tree of Life. The former represented Regardie's own Kabbalistic studies, while the latter is usually considered Regardie's magnum opus and one of the most comprehensive texts on practical magic ever written. The book was primarily a restatement of the original teachings of the Golden Dawn and contained very little Crowleyanity. The Tree of Life was dedicated to Crowley under the name of Marsyas, a pseudonym that Crowley used in his poem, Aha. About 5 years later, in 1937, Regardie sent his old friend a copy of The Tree of Life with a warm note. Unfortunately, Crowley's response to Regardie's kindness was less than kind, chiding the sensitive young author with an anti-Semitic slur about his recently adopted name of Francis, a name given to Regardie by a lady friend who thought he had a lot in common with St. Francis of Assisi. Regardie took offense and wrote Crowley an inflammatory letter designed to sting him, which apparently it did. Crowley retaliated by circulating an abusive and slanderous letter about Regardie to all of his friends and acquaintances. The result was a final and complete break between the two men. Regardie was deeply wounded by the breakup of the friendship and was only able to pardon Crowley in his later years. In 1970, when he wrote The Eye in the Triangle, an interpretation of Aleister Crowley, Regardie's charitable nature and his ability to be forgiving toward his old friend was evident. The publication of The Tree of Life caused quite a stir in magical circles of the time. In the book, Regardie outlined a few of the magical practices and teachings of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. Although the original order had ceased to exist in 1903, it continued to live on in its successors, the Stella Matutina and the Alpha et Omega. Many members of both orders remembered Crowley as a disruptive insurgent from years before. Therefore, Regardie's previous connection to Crowley caused some members to lash out at him. Other members, most notably Dion Fortune, defended him. With her support, Regardie was invited to join the Stella Matutina. In January of 1933, Regardie joined the order and made rapid progress through the grades, probably due to his exceptional abilities. However, Regardie was terribly disappointed with the chiefs of the Stella Matutina, who claimed extraordinarily high degrees, but seemed sorely lacking in magical knowledge. The order itself was in a state of demoralization and decay. The members and chiefs alike cared little for magic, other than as an irritating prerequisite for examinations in order to obtain exalted titles. Regardie concluded that the teachings of the order would not survive unless they were published, so shortly after attaining to the grade of Theoricus Adeptus Minor in 1934, Regardie left the order in December of that year. In 1937, he published much of the Golden Dawn's ceremonies and teachings in 4 volumes titled The Golden Dawn. He clearly stated his reasons for doing this in his previous book, My Rosicrucian Adventure, 1936, which documented his own experiences with the Golden Dawn. It is essential that the whole system should be publicly exhibited so that it may not be lost to mankind, for it is the heritage of every man and woman, their spiritual birthright, My motives have been to prove without a doubt that no longer is the order the ideal medium for the transmission of magic, and that since there have already been several partial and irresponsible disclosures of the order teaching, a more adequate presentation of that system is urgently called for. Only thus may the widespread misconceptions as to magic be removed. Some members of the order were incensed at this action, but others were quite happy. They no longer had to copy all the order materials tediously by hand. In Regardie's words, some approved of the publication of these books, a very few disapproved. That's all there is to it. Nevertheless, most temples of the Stella Matutina and the Alpha et Omega slowly stagnated and died, just as Regardie had predicted. But because of Regardie's actions, all students of magic today owe him an enormous debt of gratitude. According to Francis King and Isabel Sutherland, that the rebirth of occult magic has taken place in the way it has can be very largely attributed to the writings of one man, Dr. Francis Israel Regardie. Regardie made a very difficult and courageous decision to break his oath of secrecy to a lethargic Golden Dawn in order to save the valuable teaching of that order. Given the fact that many former chiefs had the appalling habit of destroying order documents rather than passing them on to future generations of initiates, it was the right thing to do. As a result, all true seekers, regardless of their education, background, location, or finances, could benefit from the Order's teachings. Not only did Regardie's work on the Golden Dawn system ensure that its body of knowledge, sometimes called the Western esoteric tradition, would survive long after the original order had ceased to exist, he is also credited with inspiring the Golden Dawn's modern revival. And of all the initiates who were associated with the original GD or its immediate offshoots, the SM and AO, Regardie, far more than any other person, demonstrated through his life, his work, and his writings, the essential wisdom and soundness of those teachings. He was the one initiate uniquely qualified for his appointed task, the task of successfully presenting magic as a therapeutic tool to the skeptical world of psychology, and ultimately to bring psychotherapy and magic together. In the winter of 1936 to 1937, Regardie was bedridden in London for 2 weeks with a bad case of bronchitis. During this time, he wrote most of what would be published as The Philosopher's Stone, a book about alchemy from a Jungian perspective. At the time, Regardie was convinced that laboratory alchemy was fallacious and that only theoretical, spiritual, or psychological alchemy was valid. By 1970, however, interaction with practical alchemists, such as Frater Albertus of the Paraclesus Research Society, caused him to change his opinion on this. He began his own alchemical experiments in a small laboratory setting. Unfortunately, one of his experiments went awry, and he seriously burned his lungs when fumes of antimony escaped in the lab. Regardie gave his alchemy equipment to a friend, and for the rest of his life he suffered from the effects of the accident. Seeing that war in Europe was imminent, Regardie returned to the U.S. in 1937, where he immersed himself for a number of years in the study of psychology and psychotherapy. He was grateful for his previous experience with the Golden Dawn and a lengthy Freudian analysis, for both of which I can say in all humility and simplicity, thank God. These were the two influences which led him to write The Middle Pillar in 1938. The Art of True Healing would soon follow. In 1941, he graduated from the Chiropractic College of New York City with a degree in psychology and took up practice as a lay analyst. He was particularly intrigued with the work of Wilhelm Reich. When America became involved in the World War II, Regardie discontinued his practice and joined the army, something he later considered a huge mistake. When the war was over, he continued his studies and received a doctorate in psychology. For a time, he explored Christian mysticism with as much energy as he had previously pursued Hindu, Jewish, and Buddhist systems. He was especially drawn to Christian Science, New Thought, and the Unity school of Christianity, which taught that faith, belief, and the power of positive thinking could cure physical illnesses. He concluded that the healing techniques taught by these different schools had validity, and he explored these ideas in The Romance of Metaphysics, 1946. In 1947, Regardie relocated to California and set up practice as a chiropractor and a Reichian therapist. He also taught psychiatry at the Los Angeles College of Chiropractic. During this time, he contributed articles to various psychology magazines, including the American Journal of Psychotherapy and Psychiatric Quarterly. Throughout the 1950s, Regardie distanced himself from the occultists and concentrated on establishing his practice, which brought him a comfortable income. He had 3 marriages which all ended in divorce. He had no children. His interest in magic never waned, as can be seen by such books as The Art and Meaning of Magic, 1964, 12 Steps to Spiritual Enlightenment, 1969, A Practical Guide to Geomantic Divination, 1972, How to Make and Use Talismans, 1972, and Foundations of Practical Magic, 1979. Regardie retired from his practice in 1981 and moved to Sedona, Arizona, where he continued to write. His later books included Ceremonial Magic, 1980, The Lazy Man's Guide to Relaxation, 1983, and The Complete Golden Dawn System of Magic, 1984. He continued to give advice on health and magical matters until the end of his life. We came to know Regardie through Grady McCurtree, former caliph of the OTO. We had established our own independent Golden Dawn Temple in Columbus, Georgia in 1977, and were in the process of building the Vault of the Adepti. At that time, we were also involved with the OTO, because we were told that the Golden Dawn no longer existed in any form. Grady was well aware that our primary interest was the Golden Dawn, as since he and Regardie were friends, eventually he was kind enough to give us Regardie's address. We were ecstatic. We had assumed that Regardie passed on years ago. We wrote to Regardie and initiated what was to become a rewarding magical adventure and close friendship. Regardie, as we knew him, was small in stature, but great in spirit. In his later years, the shyness and inhibition of his youth was gone. In its place was a vitality, a ready smile, a no-holds-barred honesty, and a mischievous Scorpio sense of humor. He enjoyed good food and drink, boxing, professional wrestling, Salvador Dali, and Mozart. He enjoyed the unique red rock outcroppings of Sedona as much as he enjoyed playfully teasing the local New Age inhabitants of that town. Although Regardie believed that no magician should be poor or have to struggle to make a living, he was adamantly opposed to the idea of spiritual gurus or magical groups exploiting students for personal financial gain. On March 10, 1985, Regardie died of a massive heart attack while entertaining friends at a restaurant. We had visited him in his home just 10 days prior. His death was a great blow to us. A few days later, we performed the requiem ceremony from the Golden Dawn in his honor, in conjunction with the reading of one of his favorite pieces, the Prayer of the Sylphs. Although Regardie is gone, his written works continue to teach and inspire new generations of students. Regardie's classic book, The Middle Pillar, introduces a psychological perspective on magic and occultism, and presents an intelligent and viable rationale promoting the practice of certain magical techniques, the effects of which can be compared to the processes of analytical psychology. Regardie gave readers clear directions on how to perform the Kabbalistic cross, the lesser banishing ritual of the pentagram, and the middle pillar exercise, along with its accompanying methods of circulating the light, the vibratory formula, and the building up of the tree of life in the aura. Regardie, more than any other individual, saw the vast potential of the middle pillar exercise, which was first published in a rather incomplete form in the manuscripts of the Stella Matutina. Regardie realized that this simple ritual could be adapted into a variety of exercises with varying levels of complexity and spiritual development, or used for numerous purposes such as charging talismans and healing oneself or healing others. He firmly advocated that the middle pillar exercise was an excellent and multifaceted tool that could be easily accessed and employed by any and all for the purpose of self-development and self-healing. Regardie must be credited for the popularity that the middle pillar exercise and its numerous variants have enjoyed among ceremonial magicians, mystics, and New Agers for the past several decades. Regardie also brought the disciplines of analytical psychology and magic together as a holistic mechanism for human development. As an author, Regardie's style of writing was refreshing, inspiring, comprehensive, and non-elitist. Now, nearly 60 years since the middle pillar was first published, it remains a fine introduction to the psychological processes underlying all magical work. It is with great pleasure, then, that we responded to Llewellyn publisher Carl Weschek's suggestion that Regardie's classic The Middle Pillar be reprinted and its ideas expanded on so that new generations of seekers could benefit from it. We hope that the material we have contributed to this new annotated edition is a fitting tribute to Regardie's original work, which was so instrumental in our own spiritual path. Part 1 of the third edition of The Middle Pillar contains Regardie's masterpiece in its entirety. We have redrawn the illustrations and added titles for Regardie's chapters. We have also applied standard rules of capitalization to Regardie's text and changed the style of certain capitalized words to italic. All endnotes are ours. In previous editions, differences in Regardie's spelling of Hebrew words such as Sephiros in place of Sephiroth, Keser instead of Kether, Tiferes rather than Tifereth, Das for Dath, and Malkus in place of Malkuth are due to a variation in dialect, Ashkenazi Hebrew versus Sephardic Hebrew. His early works including the Middle Pillar, featured the Ashkenazic dialect, which was a form of Hebrew pronunciation used in Central Europe. Later, he adopted the more common Sephardic Mediterranean dialect, which was used by many Kabbalistic authors, translators, and most Golden Dawn magicians. The Sephardic pronunciation is used almost exclusively by Western magicians today. With this in mind, we have changed the spelling of the words mentioned above in this edition of the Middle Pillar to reflect the modern usage that most readers are familiar with. Part 2 contains our own work titled The Balance Between Mind and Magic. This comprises a number of chapters which we have added to supplement and enhance many of the ideas introduced by Regardie in Part 1. Chapter 6 contains a further exploration of the principles of Jungian psychology and Kabbalah. In the foreword of The Middle Pillar, written in 1938, Regardie expressed a desire to add more information on the art of relaxation and its importance to the individual's well-being. Chapter 7 provides several exercises for this. Both solitary and group work is covered. Chapter 8 examines the Eastern system of the chakras, including the similarities and differences between the Kabbalistic and yoga systems of self-growth. An exercise for activating the chakras is included. The use and symbolism of the pentagram ritual and the middle pillar exercise are investigated in chapters 9 and 10, which also give Egyptian, Greek, Gaelic, and shamanic versions of these rituals for the benefit of those readers who are not especially drawn to the language of Hebrew, but nevertheless would like to experience the energies involved. Also included is a revised and expanded version of the Middle Pillar by Regardie himself, along with exercises for healing and charging talismans. The appendix reflects a portion of a larger work called The Musical Kabbalah by Tom Parrott, which builds upon the musical correspondences of Hebrew letters and words used in the Middle Pillar and Pentagram rituals. Also included is a glossary of psychological and magical terms. Regardie's legacy lives on through each and every individual who values and finds meaning in his written works. We strongly suspect that readers of the Middle Pillar will discover that Regardie was an inspirational writer, an ethical magician, a skilled therapist, a caring healer, a great teacher, a consistent guide, and a companion on the path of the magic of light. Cheek, Cicero, Sandra Tabitha Cicero, Mellotron House, Winter Solstice, 1996. Introduction to the second edition. The world is in crisis. Men of all ages look in despair on the chaos which is their inheritance from countless generations of forebears, and join in what has become a universal cry of disillusionment. Stop the world, I want to get off. Unfortunately, it isn't that easy to get off. Answers are not as simple as some might have supposed. And assuming they were, where would people go once they got off the merry-go-round? Many centuries ago, certain sages approached the problem from another angle and found what they considered a practical solution. If life is sorrow, then the only thing to do is end this sorrowful existence by getting off the perpetually revolving wheel of existence. Life follows life, incarnation follows incarnation, and all of them spell anxiety and sorrow. For these sages, it was apparent that it might be millions of years before the masses of humanity would develop enough insight to be able to terminate the sorrowful cycle of existence. But for the illuminated individual who will apply himself to a specific psycho-spiritual discipline, escape might come aeons sooner than for the average member of mankind. This release, they learned, comes only through the achievement of a higher consciousness by the individual. Call it cosmic consciousness, the mystical experience, communion with God, all spell the same message: release. None may know it for another. Each man must attain for himself awareness of his oneness with infinite life, the consciousness that a state of separateness exists only within his own mind. Not until man does recognize that he himself, a microcosm of the macrocosm, a reflection of the universe, a world within himself, ruled and governed by his own divinity, can he escape from the wheel. It is the achievement of this one realization which all schools of mysticism, magic, and various forms of occult teaching refer to as the great work. The great work is not accomplished overnight, or even in one lifetime, but the sooner the aspirant undertakes the task, the sooner will it be finished, and the quicker will he be released from this cycle of necessity, the wheel of evolution to which common humanity is bound. Millions of years may pass in the normal process of evolution before the mass of mankind will reach the state of freedom which those few individuals who apply themselves to this work can accomplish in a fraction of the time. And the paradox that then dawns upon them that life, instead of being sorrowful, may just as well be the opposite. Remember all ye that existence is pure joy, that all the sorrows are but as shadows. They pass and are done, but there is that which remains. And as it has also been written, I am divided for love's sake, for the chance of union. This is the creation of the world, that the pain of division is as nothing, and the joy of dissolution all. Herein lies the value of magic. Under ordinary conditions, months may be required for the flowering of a plant, but the use of a hothouse will produce identical results within a few weeks. An understanding and application of magic can telescope the time required for man to acquire the realization of his own divinity. Then, once he has become aware of the existence of his higher self and works in a cooperation rather than opposition to it, once he looks to it for guidance and direction, thenceforth regarding his ego as a tool, sharpened and polished to be employed now to fulfill the divine plan rather than in the indulgence of his own petty purposes, then will his way become easier. Long before obtaining his final release, then may he move forward on the upward path with joy and equanimity. So it is that, at a time when the planet seems to be rocking beneath our feet, I derive great pleasure from writing an introduction to this new edition of the Middle Pillar. It is that pillar which stands dependable and relatively changeless as the Sphinx between the extremes of mercy and severity, the two outer pillars of the Kabbalah's tree of life. Equally important, it also provides basic principles of magic which can speed the student on his way to be blessed release from the necessity of the accursed wheel. Once he has gained this new understanding, the student, it is to be hoped, will gradually but steadily progress until he has completed the great work. In doing so, not only will he help himself by stepping up his own evolutionary processes, but to that degree will have raised the frequencies of his fellow man, and even the planet itself, since all that is one. Francis G. Wickes, in The Inner World of Choice, points out that we must accept the experience that will bring to birth a latent potential, and be willing to dare the leap into the unknown, diving deep into the unconscious, in search of the other unborn or lost potentials of the self. The middle pillar should prove a trustworthy guide on this search. It involves several distinct methods, each of which has been designed for a specific purpose, yet all work together to accomplish the ultimate goal, to erase the barrier between the conscious self and the unconscious, and to enable the student to find within the self the great self who is in reality the only savior he will ever have. The use of the Kabbalistic cross, as described in an early chapter, serves as an ideal image of aiding the ego to undergo an enormous expansion, to open up consciousness on a voluntary, ordered level to the dictates of the unconscious. The so-called banishing ritual of the pentagram is a vital technique designed to eliminate undesirable elements from the psychic sphere, and thus to permit the process of conscious expansion to proceed without harm or hindrance. The use of the archaic exercise referred to as the middle pillar will increase the field of attention, aid in the achievement of balance and equilibrium, and unfold to the aspirant a completely new and remarkable sphere of power and spiritual perception. Every technique of magic is intended in various ways to widen the field of vision of the conscious ego to the deeper, more spiritual aspects of the divine nature, which, in reality, is his true or higher self. Of the numerous techniques available in the vast armamentarium of magic for this purpose, the most vital and essential ones are summed up in the simple exercises outlined in this book. Ceremonial magic enables man to become an engine capable of harnessing and directing the enormous power that lies within. A multitude of basic principles are utilized to this end. Adoration, which is essential to attaining a sense of unity with Godhead, concentration, development of will, and the use of it to accomplish a given purpose, achievement of self-awareness, and the ability to breathe properly. Those are but a few of the benefits to be derived from persistent application to the basic practices herein discussed. Various symbolisms are employed in those phases which deal with adoration, but the choices of symbols is actually unimportant. Once it is realized that basically all religions are one and all prophets are true, it is quite logical to borrow any set of symbols from one religion for a certain purpose, and another set from a second religion for a different purpose. Nor will the practices be of passing value. On the contrary, the set of adorations to the student will learn from this book are to be integrated for all time into the daily pattern of living. Next, and important, is the achievement of a heightened sense of awareness, of self-awareness. All other exercises and complex procedures actually begin from this heightening of self-awareness. To the degree that the horizon of one's self becomes expanded, to that extent does the self become enlarged. The development of proper breathing habits will serve many purposes, including eradication of considerable neuromuscular tension, with a consequent increase of energy and vitality. The air by which we are surrounded, and in which we live and move and have our being, is the essence of life itself. Consequently, we live literally surrounded by circumambient sea of energy and vitality, a divine force which can be assimilated by the simple process of learning to breathe in a proper rhythm, altogether apart from more abstruse occult theories. Once he has gained control over his mental processes, the student can then learn to stimulate and direct his emotions. This becomes will. So complete and interlocking are the details of this system that the emotions can then be utilized as a tool to be used in directing and holding the mind steady on a given objective. For fervor and conviction are essential to activating the productive and creative agency within man. In the process, over a period of time, life becomes consecrated so that all one's energies become automatically concentrated in a continuous devotion to God, or the one life that courses through all of us. In short, the student achieves a perfect and harmonious identification with divine power, life, and love. And then he will know that existence is pure joy, that all the sorrows are but as shadows. They pass and are done. The middle pillar was originally dedicated to S. L. McGregor Mathers and Dr. William Wynne Westcott, who were chiefs of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, to which I owe so very much. The book is merely the simplest possible representation of some of the elementary practices of that order. In actuality, it is an attempt to simplify and combine the practices both of the Golden Dawn with the insights and later developments of Aleister Crowley. The real virtue of the book lies in its correlation of the practice of magic to modern psychotherapy. For magic places the achievement of self-awareness second in importance only to the achievement of unity with God. And Jung's definition of psychotherapy was that which enabled one to become conscious of what hitherto was unconscious. For untold thousands of years, man has lived in subjugation to the unconscious forces of nature, powerful instincts and drives which led him to act without deliberation or conscious volition, and in complete ignorance, in fact, of the forces at work which really motivated him. The great work recognizes that in these deep unconscious levels lies a great storehouse of power, awareness, and vitality, which must not only be awakened but recognized and equilibrated for the human being to function at maximum capacity and efficacy. This, in short, is the major purpose and function of the teachings of this book. I had first begun to read about psychoanalysis in the writings of Freud and Jung as early as 1926. I cannot say they meant very much to me, save as intellectual stimuli of a fascinating kind. When I first wrote The Middle Pillar, I had just entered psychoanalytical therapy, thanks to the influence of a very dear friend. The tremendous value and importance of psychotherapy as a prelude to any serious magical training was just beginning to dawn upon me. My work with Dr. E. A. Clegg of Harley Street and with Dr. J. L. Bendit, a Jungian of Wimpole Street in London, led me to realize the importance of psychotherapy to the beginner in mysticism and magic. In fact, 35 years later, in 1968, I am more strongly of the opinion than I was then. So fervently do I feel about this, that since that time I have acquired some of the qualifications necessary to practice various forms of psychotherapy, particularly that of Wilhelm Reich, whose work I regard as a bridge between conventional psychotherapy and occultism. I doubt if Reich would be pleased to learn of this association of mine, but a fact it is, nevertheless. Today I will not be so much as consider even the discussion of the great work with a student until he has experienced some form of psychotherapy, I care not which. There is lacking, until then, a common frame of reference and a common medium of communication. In The Middle Pillar will be discovered the first glimmerings of insight I had in that particular direction. It still holds good today. The wisdom of enlightenment is inherent in every one of us. It is because of the delusion under which our mind works that we fail to realize it ourselves, and that we have to seek the advice and guidance of the highly enlightened one before we can know our essence of mind. You should know that so far as Buddha nature is concerned, there is no difference between an enlightened man and an ignorant one. What makes the difference is that one realizes it, while the other is kept in ignorance of it. Sutra of Wei Lang. Forward. This book was completed in February 1936, anterior to the writing of The Art of True Healing, whilst I was still a resident in London. My point of view since that time has undergone considerable revision, mostly by way of extension. I could easily have altered the text to conform to my present thinking on such matters as the importance of the art of relaxation in relation to the welfare both of body and mind. But I have refrained from doing so, since such alteration would interfere with the integrity and continuity of the book as an expression of myself at that time. For me, The Middle Pillar marks a certain state of psychological development. I prefer not to tamper with temporal markings and inner milestones. Such a stage may correspond with that of other people who may thus find it of no little value, I hope, to themselves. Possibly in the near future I may dilate at greater length and freedom upon the important implications of relaxation and psychological analysis insofar as they have a bearing upon spiritual development and unfoldment. Israel Regardie, January 31, 1938, New York City. Part 1. The Middle Pillar. Israel Regardie. A co-relation of the principles of analytical psychology and the elementary techniques of magic. Chapter 1. The Two Pillars of the Temple. To me, one of the most significant and extraordinary characteristics of modern thought is the widespread circulation of books on psychology in its various branches. There is a general interest in matters dealing with the mind, especially with that aspect of the hinterland of the mind, which has been named the unconscious for want of better words, and also because its realm at the moment is so ambiguous to us. There could hardly be an educated individual who has not some slight degree of acquaintance with this analytical psychology. Even if this familiarity ran only to an acquaintance with several of the more commonly employed cliches, such as libido, the unconscious, conflicts and resistances, neuroses and complexes, that in itself would be indicative of a phenomenon which surely has occurred seldom before in the history of civilized thought. To meet this widespread interest in matters psychological, a number of books have been written to give the general reader some notion of that peculiar world with which it is the province of an analyst to deal. Quite a number of these are extremely informative, providing a very sane and balanced view of the subject. On the other hand, as is inevitable, there is a large number which might just as well have remained unwritten. One of the most curious misconceptions promulgated by some of these latter is the fact that analytical psychology, and here I use this term in its widest sense to cover the various schools inaugurated by Freud, Jung, Adler, etc., is a thing quite apart, and that the one thing which stamped out our ancestors as barbarians and savages was their utter lack of acquaintance with psychotherapy. It would be totally absurd for anyone to minimize all that has been achieved by modern psychology due to the efforts of such astute investigators as Freud and Jung. But it is abundantly clear that their protagonists, psychological extremists, go entirely too far in disclaiming the intelligence and insight of our predecessors. For the facts are, as but little research indicates, that so far from being ignorant of analytical psychology, the ancients, and particularly those of the East and Hither East, had evolved a highly complex and elaborate scheme not only of analysis, but also of spiritual development and synthesis. Some orthodox diehards may question the relationship of modern psychology with discredited Oriental and archaic techniques for the unfolding of man's higher or spiritual nature. In practice, however, such a relationship does indubitably exist. It is a fact of clinical and consulting room experience, for during the course of a protracted analysis, the cruder and more superficial unconscious levels have been uncovered and moral conflicts resolved, symbols and theme motifs of a religious or spiritual nature do make their entry across the threshold of consciousness. This entry is by way of dream, intuition, and by direct apprehension. Not only is this so, but they exert a potent influence on the entire personality, producing integrity, a new and more equilibrated attitude towards life, and an unification of the various strata of consciousness, which collectively we call man. What modern psychology has quite possibly accomplished is an advance over the efforts of our predecessors in the way of a cathartic technique. Moreover, because of modern devices, the methods of analytical psychology have been brought nearer to the understanding and convenience of the ordinary man of the street. In the past, the techniques of attainment, mysticism, magic, and yoga, or by whatever names such systems were denoted, were always several removes from the ken of the average individual. The psychologies of the past may be summarized by the use of the words yoga and magic. The subject of yoga has already been excellently dealt with by several able and competent writers, requiring therefore but little mention here. Such a book as Yoga and Western Psychology by Geraldine Coaster must certainly take its place historically as a genuine and first-rate contribution to the progress of analytical psychology. There is also the compilation of the Buddhist Lodge, Concentration and Meditation, a handbook on that subject of great merit. A number of modern psychologists have also examined the subject of yoga and meditation as a whole, and have found much that is sympathetic to and explanatory of their own systems. And furthermore, the mystical systems posit a goal and general schema which expand the rather hazy and indeterminate character of a very large part of our psychotherapeutic systems. Analytical psychology and magic comprise, in my estimation, two halves or aspects of a single technical system, just as the body and mind are not two separate units, but are simply the dual manifestations of an interior dynamic something. So psychology and magic comprise, similarly, a single system whose goal is the integration of the human personality. Its aim is to unify the different departments and functions of a man's being, to bring into operation those which previously, for various reasons, were latent. Incidentally, its technique is such that neurotic symptoms, which were too insistent upon expression, either become eliminated or toned down by a process of equilibration. It will be obvious then that by magic we are not considering a theatrical craft or jugglery, and certainly not that medieval superstition which was the child of ignorance begotten by fear and terror. These definitions should be expunged from our thinking. For centuries, magic has been quite erroneously associated with such pathologies as witchcraft and demonolatry, due to the duplicity of charlatans and reticence of its own so-called authorities. Even today, the custodians of this knowledge, harassed by personal problems and more especially by their own power complex, are still adamant in their traditional refusal to circulate a more accurate description of the nature of magic. Possibly, even they have lost all understanding of its principles. No wonder is it that misconception exists. With the exception of very few works which have attracted the attention of but a fractional part of the reading public, little has been written to act as a definitive exposition of what magic really is, insomuch as something of the nature of modern psychology is at least partially understood by a fair section of the educated world. Were it said that magic is akin to and concerns itself with that same subjective realm of psychology, some notion of its character and objectives come within hailing distance. So far as the average man or aspirant to magic is concerned, unquestionably, the analytic technique should comprise the first stage of the routine employed in spiritual development. For until one understands himself according to that peculiarity, penetrating light which psychology has thrown upon our motives, he cannot hope to bring effectively into operation the dormant side of his nature. And lest anyone casually dismiss the desirable self-knowledge as a goal easily attained to, or, it may be, already obtained, one can only utter a solemn warning that this is not so simple as at first sight seems. That self-knowledge is necessary to the pursuit of magic is self-evident. At once we are faced at the portal by guardians armed to the teeth. Such queries confront us as, Suppose the interest in spiritual culture were motivated by a desire to escape from the turbulence of physical life. What if one's stubbornly defended point of view were only an elaborate rationalization to conceal the sense of insecurity, the dull but inconsistent ache of inferiority? These are quite often the unrecognized factors which compel refuge in the religious avocation, even as in various branches of science, too. The search for, and quite often assumed discovery of some paternal-like God, or a testy senior after the fashion of Jehovah, frequently has its origins in an adolescent rejection of the Father. This deliberately forgotten has become so deep that the inner psychic necessity for the authority and affection of the Father is unconsciously projected outwards into a terrifying and awe-inspiring deity. Discernment of the true motives of conduct and attitude towards life is, therefore, an absolute essential. This accomplished, then may be examined that other side of the medallion, which is man's own psyche. As a practical system, magic is concerned not so much with analysis as with bringing into operation the creative and intuitive parts of man. A psychological technique can never be a wholly integrative one until it accepts this spiritual side of man and assists the analysis in the recognition of or acquaintance with its activity. At this moment, the treatment of these matters remains almost entirely within the domain of magic alone. Fully does it recognize the necessity for integration. Not only does it accept and recommend the result of analysis, but it proceeds still further. If analysis aims at the acceptance of the unconscious and the validity of its coexistence with consciousness, then magic may be said to be a technique for realizing the deeper levels of the unconscious. These are levels of power and realization whose value we can but dimly grasp through contemplation of religious figures of the past. Buddha, Jesus, Krishna, Saint Francis, and a host of others are instances of such illuminated men, of individuals who have striven, all in different ways, to know themselves and attain to a realization of their true divine nature. If so we wish, the techniques they employed we may call devotion, meditation, and contemplation. Fundamentally, however, they are identical in spirit with what we now propose to discuss as magic. In the latter, however, the entire process of attainment has been systematized and developed almost into an exact science, having as its foundation the discovery of Godhead. While there may be very few in life who can attain to the full realization of their divine origin and nature, yet for all of us there is some value to magic, some degree of fulfillment or attainment available. There is none so small as cannot employ it to some good and noble end, none so great as cannot better himself morally and otherwise, thus rendering himself more efficient to cope with and understand life and the world, both about and within him. These are objectives which, notwithstanding the magnitudes of their vision, are within the reach of every man. It is not yet the moment to enter into a disquisition on the intricacies of magical ritual, but in order to expound fundamental psychological and spiritual principles, it is necessary to refer to what are known technically as the two pillars. Halfway between the east and west, and north and south, in a properly instituted temple, are placed two upright pillars. One of these is colored white, the other colored black. These pieces of lodge furniture are emblematical of the two opposites functioning in the diverse operations of nature. Just as the temple represents in miniature the whole of life by which we may ever be confronted, or rather the manifold parts of our own inner nature, so these two pillars symbolize some aspect of these phenomena. They represent light and darkness, heat and cold. In man, they stand for love and hate, joy and pain, mind and emotion, life and death, sleeping and waking. Every pair of opposites conceivable to the human mind find their representation in the implication of these two pillars. Now, one of the most important ideas communicated to the student of magic in his ceremonial initiation, when he is led from one station to another, is that an extreme leaning either to one or the other of the opposites is a very dangerous thing. It is unwise to swing to opposite poles of life's pendulum. Unbalanced power is the ebbing away of life. Unbalanced mercy is but weakness and the fading out of the will. Unbalanced severity is cruelty and the barrenness of mind. Were we to change the terminology of the speech, instead of the word mercy, we might substitute emotion or generosity, or love for severity. We may substitute power, the rational side of us, or justice, or tyranny. Either of these qualities, when carried to an extreme, unmodified by the other, is conducive to an unhealthy state of psyche. Thus it is that in so religiously authoritative a book as the Bhagavad Gita, which some consider one of the finest pieces of devotional and philosophical literature yet penned, we find it stated, "Be free from the pairs of opposites." The whole of life, it is in fact the law of nature itself, seems to be dominated by these extremes or opposites, two contending forces, and one which unites them eternally, two basal angles of the triangle, and one which forms the apex. Such is the origin of creation. It is the triad of life. Only a little reflection will convince the reader of the truth of this theorem. Until we have acquired wisdom and understanding, we swing during the 70-year span of our lives between self-esteem and self-disgust, from an exaggerated estimation of our fellows to their utter and final condemnation. Age, it is true, does bring moderation and temperance with it, but were this more balanced attitude toward life cultivated, taught or adopted earlier or before middle age set in, how much more efficient could we not be, and what could we not achieve? The technique under consideration consists primarily in the conscious reconciliation of opposing forces. It is this which has been called the development of the golden flower. Before proceeding further, it is very interesting piece of speculation to consider the trinities of various religions. Most of them resolve themselves when all theological argument and intellectual quibbling are eliminated, into some such relationship as father, mother, and son. Osiris, Isis, and Horus are an excellent example. This is also true of the Christian system, where, upon careful consideration, we find the Holy Ghost defined as a feminine aspect of the Godhead. And in the Hebrew Kabbalah, we have the Trinity on the tree of life of Chesed, mercy, Gevurah, might, and Tifareth, equilibrium or beauty. Correlating this latter triad with traditional symbolism, Chesed is masculine, referred to Jupiter, a paternal wisdom symbol. Gevurah, feminine, is attributed to Mars, indicative of great power. One alchemical aphorism expresses this duality in the words, "Man is peace and woman is power." Bearing all these in mind, we conclude that as Chesed represents the father and Gevurah the mother, so Tifareth, which is beauty, is the reconciler between them. Interestingly enough, Tifereth is referred to the Son and corresponds to the third member of the theological trinity, the Son. Looking at these trinities as so many expressions of psychological fact, that is, as previously defined, as factors active within the psyche itself, we are struck by similarity of the religious point of view with the idea of the middle way. It is the pursuit of this middle path which leads to self-conquest and the steady growth of the golden flower, the wakening of the imprisoned soul within. The father and mother may be said to correspond to the two pillars of the temple, to the two extremes or opposites. In this sense, they are the tendencies exhibited by all the phenomena of nature. They are the extremes of spirit and matter, love and hate, life and death, ebb and flow, systole and diastole. Nature itself is the embodiment of the two extremes, the two opposites of the Trinity. Man, unenlightened man, one in whom neither wisdom nor understanding has been brought to birth, likewise fashions his life in the way of these two extremes. Or rather, these extremes fashion his life for him, for he is, as though by compulsion, driven by some external force he knows not of, between the poles of extreme love and hate, swinging from kindness and maudlin generosity to bursts of uncontrolled anger, hate, and meanness. His actions, almost without a single exception, are so many semi-hysterical flights from pole to pole of his emotions. He is, as it were, under the dominion of the father and the mother. To the student of the psyche, to the one who seeks wisdom and the knowledge of his higher self, the counsel has always been given to avoid the opposites. His task is to refrain from the compulsion of extreme actions. In certain schools of thought, where the rites of initiation were celebrated by adepts who at one time thoroughly understood the technique they employed, initiation ceremonies depicted the burial of the high self and its rebirth by means of a technical system of magic and meditation. Therein, the higher self was always represented by some sacred figure of the major religions, a man who was nearly always shown as the Son of God. The essence of the ethical injunctions of these systems was to develop the Son within. Unless Christ be born in you, look within, thou art Buddha. I do not believe these images could possibly have reference to any historical individual we know of, but rather I surmise these refer to the gradual bringing into conscious operation of a spiritual point of view, of an equilibrated attitude towards life, an attitude not exclusively directed to any extreme. Recognizing the polarity of life, such a point of view sought to steer a middle way between the tortuous and extreme activity of nature. It is the way of the reconciler, of keeping to the path between the two pillars, that balanced and harmonious position in which the candidates of the ancient initiation systems found themselves as at the major crisis and climax of their initiation. This is the technique of bringing to birth the golden son of Tifereth, the son of beauty and harmony, who is the third person of the Trinity. Thus it is that one system nowadays conceives of the great work as partaking of the recognition of the crowned and conquering child Horus, he who, while partaking necessarily of the nature of both the father and the mother, is simultaneously an entirely different and unique being. Through the result of the union of opposing forces, his nature tends to a new viewpoint in the conquest of life. For the father and mother are those forces which reconciliation is the key of life. To illustrate in another way the import of this concept, let us describe it from a practical and physical point of view. One of the major inconveniences which afflicts a large portion of mankind is constipation. In many instances of this disorder, no organic disturbance exists at all, the trouble being principally a functional one, though it must here be interpolated that even if it were organic, there is sufficient psychological evidence to indicate that this likewise may ensue from an identical series of causes. Very often, this malady does not respond to any kind of medical treatment. It is not uncommon for patients to testify that they have been recommended massage, surgical operations, drugs, nature cure, and all other types of cures. In spite of these, the illness persists unchanged. Enquiry elicits that there is, frequently, a conscious conflict between two courses of conduct. More often than not, however, the real seat of the conflict is not in consciousness at all, but exists in a far deeper level of mind, in the unconscious. It was probably around puberty that an already existent conflict developed such acuteness and severity as to require for the psychic safety of the ego to be repressed completely out of sight. From this, we might conclude, and there is some psychological evidence to this end, that the conflict is one between the instincts and social dictates. That is, because of parental training, there is blind refusal to recognize the necessity of the proper and legitimate expression of the instincts. It is denial of one side of the personality, a denial without justification or reason. It is as though, while admiring the beauty and form of the lotus, we wished not to be reminded of the slimy source where grow the roots of the plant, and therefore cut the stalk right through, severing the flower from its necessary root. This cutting of the lotus stalk has its counterpart in human minds, many of us having been cut off from our roots. For this denial of the instinctual life, in which the conscious existence, after all, has its roots, and this persistent repression, cause some degree of dissociation. That is, a severance of the integrity and unity of the psyche. The psychosis, if sufficiently intense and prolonged, produces symptoms of various sorts, rather ranging from lack of vitality, irritability, constipation, and a host of other physical and nervous disorders. With such a problem, there is but one logical method of attack. It is to recognize quite clearly that the physical symptoms are the result of an internal conflict, a conflict between the needs of the body and the self-sufficiency or cowardice of the mind. It is a conflict between the necessity to the expression of emotion and feeling and the imperious urge of the ego to escape from a vulnerable constitute of its nature. That principle which at one time had been susceptible to hurt and injury. With the frank recognition of the conflict, one should endeavor to recollect the events of his early childhood, bringing up as many memories as possible of that period, experiencing neither shame nor remorse at his discoveries. Confronting these memories with the knowledge that, as an adult in whom is the light of reason, he understands that his mature mind can dissipate the infantile emotion connected with early experiences, in which shame or inferiority or insecurity was felt. In this way, he links and applies mind to emotion, thus avoiding within him the uncontrolled play of the opposites. Their existence is neither denied nor frustrated. This is a vital point to be understood. No denial or rejection should be countenanced of what manifestly is an actual fact. No stubborn refusal to admit and accept a part of his own nature. As we have seen, the denial of any function of the self leads to dissociation, and the latter results in nervous and physical disorders. Face the fact that at one time there was a denial of one phase of life, and thus accept the conflict. Accept it, knowing that so long as we remain human, these conflicts are bound to be our lot. In our present stage of evolution, there are part and parcel of human nature, and so cannot be avoided. But what can be eliminated is the ignorant attitude so often adopted toward them. For these opposites, the two pillars of the temple, their magical images or prototypes, represent those eternal forces betwixt which the equilibrium of the universe dependeth, those forces whose reconciliation is the key of life, whose separation is evil and death. This, then, is the solution to conflict. They must be reconciled. Let me recapitulate. There must be the clear recognition of the conflict. Its exact nature must be analyzed and faced, and its presence adopted in all its implications. One must endeavor to bring up into consciousness, so far as the capabilities of the mind permit, all the memories of childhood. In a word, he should attempt to perform a species of what is called, in the Buddhist system, the samasati meditation. This consists in a cultivation and rigid examination of memory. The idea involved here is not that these recollections in themselves are worth anything, but that raising them up to the surface releases a great deal of tension associated with early experiences. There's often a tying up of nervous energy in childhood experiences, in trivial events which are allowed to be forgotten and to sink into unconsciousness. But this forgetfulness does not overcome the shock of nervous exhaustion connected with them. On the contrary, they set up what are called resistances to the flow of life and vitality from the primitive and vital layers of the unconscious level. What matters, remarks George Grodeck, the brilliant German physician-psychologist, is not to make conscious anything at all of the unconscious, but to relieve what is imprisoned, and in doing so is by no means rare for the repressed material to sink into the depths instead of coming into consciousness. What is decisive in the success of treatment is the removal of resistance. Beginning with the actual events of the day upon which the reader determines to commence this exercise, the meditation should gradually extend its field of vision until ultimately the events and occurrences of the earliest days are brought into the light of day. The earliest years are brought into the light of day. The technique is principally one of the training of the mind to think backwards. Difficult though at first it may seem, practice leads the student slowly and gradually to facility in the art of remembering. The facts of memory confronted fearlessly, without shame and discomfiture, the resistance to the flow of vitality between the various levels of consciousness is broken down, restoring physical, nervous, and spiritual health. As the childhood memories are exposed, the student will see for himself in what way the conflict now bothering him came into manifestation, since by definition a neurosis is a maladaptation of the psyche to life itself. By this process of remembering, he shall see in what he failed to respond properly to the phenomena of his existence. Realizing this and recognizing thoroughly the nature of his conflict, he must now endeavor to ignore it. More accurately, a more positive attitude should be adopted. He must develop in an entirely new direction. It must be remembered, however, and this is important, that to ignore any symptom of conflict as manifested in mind or body is dangerous until the conflict in question has been recognized and accepted. The unconditional acceptance almost invariably acts as its resolution. Any other attitude constitutes an escape. The escape mechanism is that so frequently adopted by the neurotic and must be avoided. It is the way of the coward. To face the conflict is to rob it, and its consequences of crippling fear. Honesty within oneself acts as a catharsis. One finds himself endued with a new courage and a greater ability to face one's problem in an entirely new and more practicable way. Given the recognition of the conflict causing constipation, the symptom itself may be severely ignored, relying upon the bowel after the lapse of some days to recommence functioning of its own accord. The conflict and the warring between the two sides of the psyche, tied a knot, as it were, in consciousness, preventing the perfect functioning of the whole. The immediate result of this is an impediment in the free movement of nervous energy in the body-mind system, causing stasis in that part of the system, having a relationship or correspondence with the factors concerned in the conflict. Occult theory, as we have it from tradition, may be extremely useful here. With some degree of practical experience, we could easily discover the precise nature of the original conflict by a consideration of that part of the organism to the systems of which our attention is attracted. For example, consider one troubled by nephritis. One of the most significant aspects of the magical tradition is astrology. In this latter science, the kidneys are referred to the operation of the planet Venus. As we know from mythology, Venus is the deity concerned with love, feeling, and emotion. We would surmise, therefore, that in the event that the love or emotional life of an individual has been frustrated or repressed to such a point where the psyche finally refused to continue living while hampered by such a neurosis, some expression of that frustration could be transferred to the neighborhood of the kidneys. Were the frustration complete and devastating to the psyche, it is not impossible that we should find a cancer, the symptom par excellence of the death wish, the so-called suicide complex indicative of a division in the psyche's integrity. Moreover, we could proceed a step further. We might inquire as to whether the affliction were on the right or the left, remembering the Kabbalistic definition of the left pillar as the side of mercy, and that on the right as the pillar of severity. Unbalanced mercy is weakness and the fading out of the will. Unbalanced severity is cruelty and the barrenness of mind. Enquiry might elicit the fact that an afflicted left kidney was symptomatic of one who had been afraid to taste life to the full, or on the other hand, out of sheer compensation, had lived so completely as to have overindulged. The right kidney would indicate symptoms of severe and violent repression on principle, where the entire emotional life had been so subjected to continuous frustration because of an ethical standard that the outraged eros reacted upon the body either with acute nephritis or it may be with cancer. Whether there is trouble with the legs, the patient being unable to stand and confined to the bed, some psychological thinkers proffer some such explanation as this. The legs are the things we stand on, that which gives support to the body. In the symbolic pageantry utilized by the unconscious, and it must be understood that the activity of the unconscious proceeds almost exclusively through what are to us symbols. The instinctual life is our mental support. It is that which we tend to rely upon, our stability and foundation during life. Should therefore our understanding of life fall short of what it should be for us, and obviously that standard varies with different people, so that we unduly repress our instincts to the point where the resulting sense of insecurity and anxiety become intolerable, the psyche achieves a revenge through an affliction of the supports of the personality. Thus, it is what we learn, so it is said, by illness. When our supports, no matter of what nature, have been annihilated, we sometimes seek to inquire into causes and origins. When the inquiry is honestly furthered, with a sincere view to self-knowledge, an internal resistance broken down by meditation or analysis, no doubt recovery would ensue. That is to say, the disappearance of the alarming symptoms and a return of normal function. The solvent to these difficulties, the practical solution of the problem, consists primarily in the elimination, so far as possible, of fear. Of course, from the larger point of view, fear is an essential part of our makeup. Man is so puny a creature in the face of the earth, and nature is vast and terrible in her operations. How else could it be that fear eats at the heart of each of us? But this is a wholesome fear, a fear which is the beginning of wisdom. The emotion under consideration is a pathological thing. Fear of the future, fear of position, a needless worrying about affairs which cannot be helped or changed, at least not by hugging a constant fear that they will change in a matter that is painful and sad. From the spiritual point of view, fears such as we have named act as a great freezer, as an inhibitor of action and of the free flow of vital energy from within. The man who is afraid to embark upon a given course of action because it may lead to failure, or whose apprehension of success and of the future generally is hardly likely to accomplish very much. Fear is failure, says one magical aphorism, and the forerunner of failure. Be thou therefore without fear, for in the heart of the coward virtue abideth not. One of the most interesting instances of the psychotherapeutic attitude to fear and anxiety and the escape problem as a whole was Grodek's treatment when he was a physician before applying psychology to his problems of certain cases of indigestion and nervous dyspepsia. One of the psychological theorems regarding this form of discomfort is that it is due to anxiety. We all know how bad news or worry affects the digestion, from turning the food sour to taking away the appetite. But the root cause of this particular anxiety is not the problem in hand, but the anxiety which has its roots in the early conflict and is made worse by the occurrence of an immediate problem evoking conflict and anxiety. Grodek's treatment, almost the homeopathic principle, emphasized or comprised a diet of precisely those foods which formerly disagreed with his patient. If eggs were the cause of indigestion, the diet would comprise eggs until eventually the psychic would give up attempting to evade the associations which had been linked to eggs, and the digestive trouble would in time disappear. To force the psyche to face its own problems and accept them was his idea, rather than the psyche should continually balk from and attempt to flee the symptoms it threw up in the body. The unconditional acceptance of the conflict and the associations connected with it was the first step towards cure. The technique is, in a word or two, an attack on the escape mechanism. Integrity cannot be worn by an escapist attitude towards life. The reward of the attitude which escapes from problems and the reality of life is more likely than not to be nothing but the gnawing pain of guilt and sin. The same method is often made use of in other forms of therapy. Amongst these, for example, is the treatment of nightmares by analysis. The terror experienced in nightmare, causing the dreamer to awaken bathed in perspiration, angered by a palpitation of the heart, and experiencing an inexplicable sense of impending catastrophe, is likewise due to some conflict or other. Its nature, being unconscious, can only be determined by the context of the dream, and by lengthy process of confession, free association, and reductive analysis. But if the dreamer can be trained in his waking state to realize that the nightmare is only the expression of an internal conflict, then he has proceeded halfway to the point where it will cease to bother him. He must accept the presence of such a disorder rather than attempt to escape it, because escape is not an adequate solution of a psychic problem. The discovery was brought home to us during the war. Amongst the soldiers at the front were those who would not recognize the very obvious fact that war was a dangerous matter and that they were afraid. This they would not accept, though underneath a veritable torrent of fear was raging, and the whole of the instinctive impulse was to bolt from the scene of battle. Those who recognized this impulse, but at the same time saw that flight was impossible, and that the war had to be seen through, came to no mental or spiritual harm. It was the former type, suffering from a terrible fear, but boasting that they were not in the least afraid, who became affected by shell shock. Shell shock, the shock experienced by the nervous system through the devastating noise of explosion, had nothing to do with their actual trouble at all. The cause was simply a cowardly refusal to face the conflict raging in the psyche. And when this became so intolerable, an actual split occurred in consciousness, so that there was a gap in memory, awareness, and inefficiency. With the acceptance of the theory of conflict as a cause of nightmare, a subtle change gradually creeps into the nightmare dream. The following is one rather fine example, together with the method of dealing with it. A woman patient frequently dreamed that she was hanging from a rope in a room which had an enormously high ceiling, about 50 or 60 feet high. The rope was affixed by a hook to the ceiling, and the weight imposed upon the hook was gradually loosening the plaster around. Any moment, the hook would tear loose from the ceiling, and the body would be dashed to the ground. At this juncture of the dream, unable to face the terror of being hurled to death on the ground, the woman awoke in a frenzy of fear, screaming. The advice given in this particular case, and since the dream is a typical nightmare, the same technique may be widely recommended, was to suggest to the woman the advisability of meditating on the dream before falling asleep at night. The suggestion was to lengthen the term of the dream so as to invite the nightmare and observe what happened when the plaster did finally break, tearing the hook from the ceiling. Constant and deep reflection on the dream's theme before sleep was the method by which the unconscious could so be influenced as to induce a vigilant attitude even during the progress of the fantasy. The topic of meditation would also be the conscious application of the idea of non-resistance. Let the catastrophe occur and see what happens. If the fantasy being perched on a high cliff and at any moment there is a danger of being hurled to the ground, awakening at midpoint in a sweat of fear, then gradually train the mind to thrust out all resistance to the fall. By methods such as these, resistance and repression is broken down, and fear eliminated from the sphere of consciousness. Here some words should be said about repression and the means of its elimination. A great many people have come to believe, though a very casual reading of some of the early psychoanalytic literature, that psychology countenances the removal of repression by means which are unethical and antisocial. Nothing could be further from the truth. Repression is always defined as an unconscious and automatic process. It is a process by which the personality protects itself against distasteful concepts by thrusting them without the horizon of consciousness into the dark and forbidding regions of the unconscious. Since this process begins very early in life, the unconscious is, by middle age, stuffed with a mass of repressed material ideas about parents and relatives, associations connected with environment, infantile beliefs and actions. Suppression, on the other hand, is a deliberate and conscious thing. It presupposes a process of conscious selection and elimination, in which one alternative is suppressed in favor of another. There is no need to live an antisocial or vicious life, one of self-indulgence or of degradation, as so many people think. To be free from a repression does not argue that one should have behaved like a young man about town, though that is not to say that a reasonable satisfaction of the instinctual life should be eschewed where this is at all possible. But the frank realization and acceptance of the human personality as many-sided, and a refusal to blind oneself to experience, no matter of what kind, will go far towards relieving the partition erected between the unconscious and the conscious, and removing resistance and repression. To restate the attitude expounded in this chapter, I conceive of analytical psychology as the spouse of the ancient system of magic. For psychology has succeeded in evolving a system which can be applied to almost any individual who wishes to know the several departments and constituents of his own personality. Possibly for the first time in the history of civilized thought, there is a technique which is of inestimable value to the average man. It is of supreme value to the student of magic and mysticism, who, too often, labors under several delusions of what it is that he hopes to accomplish, and in what length of time he will do so. A study of analysis will prove, first of all, that he cannot proceed quicker than his own unconscious permits him. This will prevent gate crashing and an irrational enthusiasm and desire for speed. Secondly, through the elimination of erroneous ideas as to himself, the phantasms of wish fulfillment and insensate daydreaming, he will have obtained a more comprehensive account of what magical and meditation systems can accomplish, and what degree of achievement in these spheres is open to him. He will be entirely less subject to delusion and deception, because his attraction to magic will not have been caused by the unconscious desire to escape from the pressing problems of his immediate existence, with which he finds himself unable efficiently to cope. Moreover, he will have familiarized himself with the true extent of his own sense of inferiority. The compulsive necessity of becoming unduly aggressive because of an imagined or pathological inferiority will no longer urge him to an intolerable sense of deficiency. Being acquainted with the fundamental problem of insecurity, which every thinking individual is bound to have, since man is so apparently insignificant and unimportant when compared to the vastness of the universe, he will not be liable to adopt extreme religious or scientific notions from so-called spiritual experience or laboratory experiment to buttress up his own desire for some one thing which is secure and reliable. Analysis is the logical precursor of spiritual attainment and magical experiment. It should comprise definitely the first stage of spiritual training. Were it possible, and were there magical schools in existence, it would gratify me enormously to see magical training preceded by 6 or 12 months of application to reductive analysis, pursued by sympathetic physicians or lay analysts who had long and intimate experience with clinical work. The magical schools must open a department of analytical psychology if their own systems are to attain public prominence worthy of attention and patronage. Such schools, though offering courses of training considerably prolonged, would eventually develop such a type of individual that the public would eliminate dangerous from its association with magic, and be obliged to take cognizance of the soundness of its technique. The union of two systems would, for magic at any rate, build up psychological credit, and a sense of great reliability and prestige would accrue to it. One of the greatest obstacles to success in magic, to any kind of worthwhile result in the mystical sciences, is that the psycho-emotional system of its average student is hopelessly clogged with infantile and adolescent predilections which have not been recognized as such. The ego is compelled to extreme courses of action as though by compulsion, and underneath his every activity lurks the unconscious specter, fear. It is precisely with these monsters of fantasy that analytical psychology can deal effectively, and it is from such absurd obstacles that the magical student is a confirmed but unconscious sufferer. By associating magic with analysis, we should be able to avoid the pitfalls by which our predecessors fell so headlong. The production of genius, more specifically a religious and mystical type of genius, ever the goal of magic, should be more within our grasp than ever before, and considerably more open to achievement. These ideas are mentioned not because a systematic union of magic and psychology will be here presented, but in the hope that this effort will spur some psychologists acquainted with magical and mystical techniques to attempt such a task. Whoever does succeed in welding the two indissolubly together, to him mankind will ever be grateful. For such a union comprises the marriage of the archaic with the modern, the unconscious with the conscious, the precursor of the birth of the golden flower, not for any individual alone, but for mankind as a whole. Chapter 2. The Tree of Life. There are then, roughly, the broad divisions of certain principles, common to both psychology and to magic. And it will be conceded by all that the problems relating to fear, anxiety, insecurity, and inferiority in connection with the broad divisions of the conscious and the unconscious are fundamental to both systems. Therefore, being able to consider any of the techniques of the methods employed by magic, it is essential that we analyze a little further this classification of the psyche into the conscious and the unconscious. While a simple outlook has certainly its advantages, yet difficulties arise demanding a further subdivision and calling for the consideration of additional factors operative within the unconscious. It is really not so simple as seems at first sight. Magic employs a somewhat more extensive view of the two primary aspects of the psyche, and it is necessary to consider at greater length the intricate nature of man, so that we may realize more or less exactly what it is that in magical experiments we are desirous of achieving. It seems to me that the division of the psyche into conscious and unconscious is entirely too simple to prove adequate as a means of explanation. The almost overused instance of the iceberg, with 1/7 of its mass above the surface and 6/7 below, is all right as far as it goes, but does it go far enough? If that division is to avail us at all in practice, that portion of the psyche which is below the surface of our normal awareness demands more insight into its nature and rather deeper analysis. There is, therefore, some wide realization of the inadequacy of this division, varying with the different schools and systems of practice. Thus, in the Freudian school, we meet with the primary concepts of the libido, which is defined with particular emphasis on the sexual urge. There is also the slightly broader classification of psychic activity into a triad of the id, the superego, and the ego. In the system propounded by Dr. C. G. Jung, we meet as before with the libido, though here it is defined not as sexuality, but in far more philosophical terms, as the sum total of psychic energy and vitality, and its expression is through instinct, desire, and function. The faculties of the mind are also described in a fourfold pattern, operating in a positive and negative way. There are the feeling, thinking, sensation, and intuitional functions of the psyche, each capable of a passive or an active response, depending upon whether the psyche be introverted or extroverted. The unconscious itself is also conceived to have a dual aspect. That part of it which is personal and individual, and that great stream of power, archetype, and image of which the former is only a part, the collective unconscious. It is a universal and uniform substratum common to the whole of mankind. We may consider it to be the historical background from which every psyche and every consciousness has proceeded or evolved. It is the primordial basis upon which each race and people and civilization evolves its own individual pattern. It is this that the medieval alchemists called anima mundi. While having innumerable points of contact with the above psychologies, the magical conception differs in several respects. For one thing, it prefers to use a diagram to express its viewpoint, believing that reflection upon this glyph, which for centuries has been an object of meditation, will yield illuminating ideas associated in the unconscious and its parts. Secondly, it believes that man is a more complex being than the newer schools would allow. The diagram it employs is a Kabbalistic glyph called the Tree of Life. This shows the 10 spheres, or Sephiroth, as they are called, arranged in a geometrical pattern to form 3 columns or pillars. That to the left shows 3 spheres, one above the other, and is called the left pillar, or the pillar of mercy. The right pillar, or that of severity, also shows 3 spheres, while the central pillar is indicated by 4 spheres, one above the other, the pillar of beneficence. To each one of these spheres is ascribed a different characteristic of the self. That is, the diagram expresses the integral nature of man according to 10 quite distinct functions. It is the unity of these 10 factors, which together comprise what we choose to call man. The id, to use the Freudian term, is the most central core of man, the deepest level of his unconscious, being represented on the tree by the uppermost sphere of the middle pillar. Reference to the chart will elucidate the problems enormously, clarifying my explanations. At the outset, a word or two must be added about the employment of foreign words and an unfamiliar terminology. It is, in my opinion, a regrettable fact that objections should be raised to unfamiliar and strange words. When some new language is to be learned, the alphabet is at first difficult to acquire. This happens in magic, for in most instances there are no terms existent in English to express the idea to be conveyed, and where such a term does exist, it does not have the appropriate psychological or spiritual background to indicate what is required of it. It is my object, nevertheless, to co-relate such terms where they do exist with those of the Kabbalistic system, to indicate that it has long recognized these concepts now being dealt with by psychology. Not only so, but it has evolved a profound technique whereby such potencies may be brought into manifest operation. The magical correspondence of the psychological id, or S, as Dr. George Grodek calls it, is the Yechida, a word meaning the monad, the self, the paternal ends of light. It is the essence of mind which is intrinsically pure, to adopt a definition of an Eastern religious text. It is also the Buddha nature, the realization of which is that alone which differentiates the enlightened man, the sage, from him who is ignorant and unenlightened. Just as in physics, where the electron may be considered either as an electrical particle or as a system of radiations or waves, so this Yechida may be considered from 2 quite distinct points of view. It is the innermost kernel of the self, the deepest core of consciousness itself, unconscious to our ordinary awareness, while on the other hand, it is the life flow itself, the current of libido, which is the sum total of our vitality and our life. Since the translation of Eastern texts has been made available, many psychologists have pounced on several Chinese terms for inclusion within the technical nomenclature of their own systems. One such term selected by Jung to have reference to a concept such as explained above in connection with the Yechida is Tao. This term, so ambiguous to the Western mind accustomed to precision and accurate definition, has been variously translated as God, or a goal, or heaven. The sinologue, Wilhelm, prefers the word meaning, and Jung employed it as having a closer association with the conception which he wished to explain, for it's precisely this factor in consciousness which, eventually, provides a meaning for life and for man. And in the diagram which is provided in The Secret of the Golden Flower, to which Jung wrote an erudite and profound European commentary, the placing of the psychic factor Tao is similar to the position of Yechida upon the Kabbalistic tree of life. Though I wish to avoid metaphysics so far as is possible, certain theories demand expression. In order to retain accuracy with simplicity, it must be stated that the Kabbalistic tradition posits a universal stream of life, described in terms of light, behind, as it were, the monad. That is to say, the Yechida, so far from being an ultimate division in itself, is but one particular point or section of the universal life, or the collective unconscious, and owes its separate existence to that pulsating stream behind it. It is interesting here to record that Grodek surmised that the unconscious, in the ordinary Freudian sense, is the precursor of reason, the brain-mind, whereas the it produces the unconscious, the brain, and everything else that belongs to life. The unconscious is a part of the psyche a part of the it. He also believed that whatever happens in and or through a man, from the moment of conception to the occurrence of death, even what he reasons out for himself and does of his own free will, everything is directed by this unknown it. If we wish to consider the self in its widest sense as consisting of so many layers of consciousness, not unlike an onion, having 10 peelings or skins, then the Yechida is the deepest or central layer. Those immediately above it, and it must be remembered that this is figurative speech and that the spatial analog does not hold good here, are what we name the Chia and the Neshama. These would correspond to the anima and the animus in the system elaborated by Jung. Again, referring to the Chinese mystical text commented upon at length by Jung, we will see that according to the Chinese, the whole of nature is permeated by two principles, one positive or masculine, the other negative or feminine. These are named the yang and the yin. These two principles are present in the human psyche, and looking at it from the widest possible point of view, we could assume that the conscious level of the mind is the yang, and the unconscious is the yin. But this division, because it is the widest generalization, is inadequate and is capable of further classification. Because within the mind there are both positive and negative elements, factors which are those of thought and feeling. This holds true also of the unconscious, and though we have referred this to the yin, within its sphere there is both a yang and a yin operation. If we refer to one of the deepest levels of the unconscious, then this yang and yin operation is what Jung means by the animus and anima, and what the Kabbalah indicates by Chia and Neshama. It may be useful to quote definitions of these two psychological principles to provide authoritative explanations as we proceed. One pupil of Jung's, Joanne Corey, the author of ABC of Jung's Psychology, says the following: the anima is in contact with the objects of the inner reality, the images of the collective unconscious, as the persona is in contact with the objects of external reality. The anima is an archetypal figure that might almost be described as the precipitate of man's age-long impressions of woman. Not his conscious reasoned ideas, but the unconscious inherited mold into which she is cast. The anima is a correspondence of the neshama, which is feminine and passive, representing the true spiritual vision of intuition or the imagination. Here it may be interpolated that it has always been an axiom of the magical system that the being which is active physically is passive spiritually, and vice versa. In many an occult work do we find some such statement as this: man is termed the positive member of the two sexes. In reality, only his physical body is positive. His etheric body is purely negative. On the other hand, while the female is commonly supposed to be the negative of the two sexes, it is really her physical body that is negative, for her etheric body is positive, and the real creative pole of the sexes. It will be readily conceded that every person is psychologically bisexual. He is a combination of both masculine and feminine elements, and within him operate the yang and the yin. In man, the feminine elements, and in woman, the masculine or positive traits, are alike unconscious. And the deepest and truest archetypes of these unconscious traits are in the anima and animus, the chia and the neshama. Here, after a fashion, is the explanation of the frequently observed phenomena of the unparalleled tenderness and love of which many a man is capable, and the harsh and cruel lengths to which certain types of women may go when infuriated or aroused. True, therefore, to its compensating or balancing principle, the soul or unconscious of a man has a feminine bias, which we refer to the anima, while that of a woman has a masculine bias, the animus. This latter is defined as a constantly changing figure, its energies in a state of continuous fluctuation. The anima is not a persistent, unvarying figure, as is the anima. The typical woman finds her conscious feeling expression centered in one person of the opposite sex. She is monogamous externally, but internally her unconscious is apparently polygamous. For the name of her animus might be Legion. He represents the logos principle, the masculine reason of her unconscious nature. On the tree of life, this animus principle is equivalent to chia, the will. This word also means life, animal life. This principle is the first creative vehicle of the S, as its other pole is neshama, understanding and love. The will is in essence a dual principle. It presupposes a beginning and an end. For obviously to will a thing is at once to admit that you have not that thing. To desire to be a thing is to assume that you are not the thing desired. True love, however, is centered always upon one object, an object with which the lover seeks to identify himself to the exclusion of all else. It is this love which fundamentally is implied in the term anima. To love is to understand. Understanding bestows insight and intuition. This is anima. Tao, animus, and anima, or yechida, chia, and neshama, constitute the innermost core of what we have chosen to call the psychic onion, the primordial principles operating in the deepest levels of the unconscious. It might be said that this is the level which is always in direct contact with the racial and universal levels of the collective unconscious. That dynamic and ubiquitous stream of life and vitality of which the Yechida, together with its vehicles, comprise just one particular center of consciousness. Before proceeding further, and since I have used the onion as a metaphor of the self, it may be wise to quote a paragraph of Grodek's Exploring the Unconscious. We all of us fancy that we must have a core at the center, something that is not merely shell. We would like to hold within us some specially dainty kernel, to be a nut protecting the future, the everlasting, and we cannot realize, that we have in fact no kernel, but are made up of one leaf on top of another from outermost to innermost, that in fact we are onions. But in the onion, every leaf shares its essential nature. The onion is honest right through, and only becomes dishonest, rotten, if it tries to grow a kernel different from the rest of it, and to destroy the peel as though it were something else, false, something no honorable onion should acknowledge. Everything in us is a peeling, but in every peeling is the essential nature of the whole. The self is an onion self. This is similar to the Buddhist conception. The triad of principles just considered, the supernals, being the more primitive part of the psyche, the ancient center which harks back to the countless epochs of the distant past. We must now turn our attention to its compensating and balancing aspect, the conscious ego. This clearly is a much more modern and recent development in the ageless history of the self, a comparatively modern evolution, a channel by means of which we have become conscious of the original primeval and fundamental unconsciousness from which we have emerged. And because of this development of awareness concerning these deeper levels of ourselves, so are we able to examine and understand them. It is by this particular evolution that we are able to make conscious the content of the unconscious. This definition of evolution is practically identical with the definitions of both psychology and magic. That is, that their objects are to expand the horizon of the mind, to enlarge the sphere or scope of consciousness itself. These methods are those of evolution itself. In magic, this conscious ego is denominated the Ruach. It comprises those spheres on the diagrammic tree of life, which are numbered from 4 to 8 inclusive. It is an aggregate of functions rather than an integrated and single unit, which is probably one reason why some psychologists believe that this part of us is as yet very unstable in its formation. Also, that the unfavorable and faulty circumstances surrounding the childhood of most people greatly enhance the tendency to disintegration which already exists. This aggregate comprises memory, will, feeling, and thinking, clustered about the ego itself, which is the central sphere, 5 in number. Its lifeblood is the current of thought and perception, just as the lifeblood of the supernals is the libido, the current of life and energy. The Jungian concept of the ego, or conscious mind, is the persona, the personality which comes into relation with external things. It is a mask. It is the individual's mode of adaptation to the world, his characters as it appears to be, and as he quite often himself conceives it. It is an evolved mechanism to acquire contact with the outside world, so that by means of experiences thus obtained, the it, or the yechida, may come to a self-conscious realization of its own divine powers and high nature. It is in connection with this persona, this thinking ruach, that we would do well to reflect upon 2 aphorisms of the Eastern psychological systems. At first sight, it would appear that they are mutually exclusive and contradictory. In one Eastern book it is written, "The mind is the slayer of the real. Let the disciple slay the slayer." This alone will be a problem to the average student. In the West, generally speaking, the universe is considered as having 2 large divisions, the physical and the mental or spiritual, the latter 2 being spoken of as synonyms. So that if the mind itself is defined as a hindrance to the perception of reality, most of us would be plunged into a rather difficult quandary. The second is, the essence of mind is intrinsically pure. Should we desire to translate terminology, we will find, I think, that the Jungian Tao, or the very deepest level of the unconscious, is as near an exact definition of essence of mind that we could find. It is only a popular and false misconception of psychological concepts that relegated the unconscious into a mere receptacle of the evil shadow beings of human nature. Some have considered it exclusively as a receptacle retaining the primeval slime deposits, harboring the most violently explosive material. But in point of fact, as but little practical acquaintance with the problems of analysis proves, the unconscious does not harbor exclusively explosive motives. The unconscious stream only becomes explosive when the ruach, the conscious mind, has repressed its legitimate and just activity. The taint of the ruach is a self-sufficient conscious outlook. Its vice is an over-refined and emasculated attitude towards life. A river dammed somewhere along its channel is bound to flow over, and when this does occur, the river cannot be blamed. Should there be necessity to erect a permanent or even a temporary dam, suitable precautions should be taken to ensure that some other channel is kept open whereby the excess waters may seek their outlet. So also with the unconscious itself, the essence of the mind, which is intrinsically pure. It is neither dangerous nor explosive, but if the individual be prevented from having access to life due to some maladaptation to environment, some failure fully to express both the yang and the yin of his nature, that repression acts as a constant source of irritation, presenting always some likelihood of a psychic explosion. It is this false dam, the obstacle which is erected along the river's course, psychological resistance, which is the mind which slays or prevents the realization of reality. How many of us really understand life and the world as they really are? This is without projecting upon our perceptions the desire of what we should like to be. Few have insight into our deepest motives, the real causes of our attraction to our friends, or of revulsion from our enemies. There are not many, I surmise, who can at times account for their actions in terms of consciousness. The majority of us are moved a great deal of the time by involuntary compulsion. It is a true saying that habits are a necessity imposed upon us by evolution to ensure the smooth functioning of the psyche, but they are necessary only in so far as they do permit the psyche to function freely. And with many, it is just that mass of habits and predilections which is the barrier to the free activity of the psyche. To question people as to the purpose of their habits, a survey of their activity, and why they were formed originally, is to obtain much illumination as to what is implied by the phrase, "The mind is the slayer of the real." In point of fact, it is not the mind which inhibits our perceiving what is real, what is worthwhile and desirable in life. It is the false development of mind, that mass of prejudices, emotional biases, improperly formulated philosophies and superstitions, relics of the inheritance from misguided parents, which is here denoted. And until we understand its nature and perceive its extent, never shall we be freed from its dominion or released from its compulsion. And until we have thoroughly understood our own behavior, motives, and the mechanism of our own attractions and repulsions, we have no insight. Possibly then we should be able to perceive that underlying this conscious mind, which hitherto we assumed as the sole reality, the only criterion of judgment, is a vast area of inspiration and beauty, which is the intrinsically pure essence of mind. If we could open ourselves or become fully conscious of this essence so that its content without distortion were capable of ascending within sight of our focus of consciousness, then should we begin to realize, as never before, the true nature of life and its problems. In such a case, remarks Dr. Young in his collected papers on analytical psychology, the unconscious vouchsafes us that furtherance and assistance which bountiful nature is always ready to give man in overflowing abundance. The unconscious possesses possibilities of wisdom that are completely closed to consciousness. It creates perspective combinations just as our consciousness does, only they are considered superior to the conscious combinations, both in refinement and extent. The unconscious may therefore be an unparalleled guide for human beings. When this state or condition of consciousness has been arrived at, when what formerly was unconscious has been brought within the horizon of consciousness, the entire character of life becomes changed and illuminated. Previously, it was a thing of fear and horror. Nearly all men, underneath, possess some sense of inferiority and insecurity. All seek in one way or another to rise above that inferiority and to discover some rock of security to which they may feel anchored. It is when we have attained to a realization of the pure essence of mind that inferiority is practically banished and security obtained. And then we can deal with life and our fellows. The ninth sphere, or sephira, on the tree of life, is that of the nephesh, which means the animal soul. It is the sphere proper of the animal instincts and urges, what may in truth be called the Freudian unconscious, that which was conscious at one time or at one stage of development, but which has since been lost to consciousness. It is regarded as comprising those psychic faculties which are not conscious. All the various automatic, habitual, and routine actions, all the things that we say and do without thinking, and all the thousand things we never really do at all, those processes are assigned to the unconscious realm, to the principle of the nephesh. To it is related the cerebellum, the hind section of the brain, and it is intimately connected with the glandular and sympathetic nervous systems. As such, it is that part of our being which regulates the circulation of the blood, the pulsation of the heart, our digestion and respiration. All the promptings of desire and the urges of passion that spring unbidden within us have their seat in nephesh. This is the underworld of the psyche through which we get comparatively close to nature, to the elemental side of life. It is the undermind in which function the primary instincts of self-preservation and reproduction. It is the seat of the sex instinct itself. The Jungian concept of the unconscious might be the appropriate term for this side of life, as is held by the Freudian school, whereas the much abused word superconscious would be distinctly descriptive of the supernal sephiroth of the Yechida, Chia, and Neshama, corresponding to the Jungian unconscious. The 10th sephira is that of the physical brain and the active physical body. Here it is that we find the receptacle in which the other principles have their abode, and the instrument through which they function. This 10th sphere, Malkuth, the sphere of action, we may consider as active as yang, when compared to Yesod, the yin, which we may define as the seat of the impelling instincts, predatory lusts, and animal impulses. On the other hand, the ruach, which is an active thinking principle, we likewise may describe as yang in relation to the yin of the supernals, which are quiet, passive, and hidden behind the scene. Malkuth has innumerable other correspondences, but a consideration of these does not at the moment concern us. It is obvious that disorders in the proper function of the higher or interior psychic principles will have their corresponding effect on the body, which, as the 10th sephira, is but the synthesis of the preceding 9. Any conflict between parts of the psychic makeup will accordingly present a physical disturbance corresponding in position and intensity to the exact nature of the lesion. By purely empirical methods, the ancients developed a vast series of correspondences between the various parts of man's body and his psychic constituents. It is this tradition which forms in reality the fundamental basis of what is true and valid in such arts as character reading, palmistry, phrenology, and the such. For as within, so without. And what is present within the mind is bound in some way to react upon the obverse of the physical medallion. There is another method of classifying the components of the psyche by means of a rather different view of the tree of life. The method just completed considered each separate sphere, but at the same time we may look at the tree from the point of view of its levels or layers. In this event, taking the first sephira alone, we have what technically is known as the archetypal world. It is that underlying essence of the unconscious, which is the most primordial of all, its functions reaching back into the immeasurable past. It is a stratum whose characteristic is those symbols and archetypes which were first assimilated to the simple homogeneous structure, if it may be called, of the evolving consciousness. The Hindu system calls this condition or state turiya, or ecstasy, absolute consciousness, and its experience in consciousness is of that rapturous type which the mystics of all ages have testified as union with God. In this divine world, we contact those subtle images, which the ancients called the gods, or rather the ordinary everyday sphere of consciousness becomes invaded by a volutational upwelling of these archaic images and archetypes, the first set of psychic forms, subtle, intangible, and dynamic, through which the libido flows on its outward journey from the it. The second and third sephiroth constitute what is called the creative world, the state of sushupti. It is that stratum of the primordial psychic sphere in which function the principles of the anima and animus, wisdom and understanding. Therefore, its reaction upon the ego would be through a stimulation of the creative faculties and an enhancement of its entire horizon and field of awareness. As the second state of consciousness, it has a correspondence with dreamless sleep. Yet even this description is inadequate, for dreamless though its characteristic may be, it is too vital to be defined in so passive a way. In certain philosophic literatures, it is held that sushupti is a state in which even criminals commune with the higher nature and enter into the spiritual plane. It is said to be the great spiritual reservoir by means of which the tremendous momentum toward evil living is checked. Though involuntary with such people, it is constantly salutary in effect. The next level to be considered is comprised of the 4th to the 9th Sephiroth, inclusive. It is called the formative world, or swapna. This is the world of dreams. It is the level of the instinctual drives and the dynamic urge to expression. Its images, the pageantry of dreams and the fantastic adventure of the night, are those supplied by the experience of the day, although the dramatization of the actual dream is the exclusive content and prerogative of this plane. Where there is an effort on the part of the higher genius, or it, to transmit noble impulses or inspiration from its own divine realm, the state of swapna has to be passed through. This passage colors the tenor of the impulse, imparting to what may originally have been pure thought and transcendentalism an emotional tone or feeling which is expressed in terms of symbolism. Thus, whatever ideas are impacted upon our consciousness from higher spheres are tinted with the dream symbolism of the formative world. A wide knowledge of the nature and significance of symbols, and an acquaintance with the operation of swapna is necessary if the original message and its meaning are to be divined. Here we have, also, the emotional mechanism providing the drive and impulse to physical action, the endocrine glands. For the physical positions of the most important glands correspond to important centers and dynamisms of this particular level of the psychic structure. The 10th Sephira corresponds to the active world, Jagrata, the top layer of consciousness, the ego, the surface consciousness, which attends primarily to the business of everyday life. It is an evolution emergent from the dark secret levels of the unconscious, and, paradox that it is, has usurped the function and rule of the source from which it has sprung. On these 4 different levels of consciousness, which the Kabbalists have called the 4 worlds, the several principles of man have their operation in unceasing activity. It is precisely with these different phases of man's psychic nature that the technique of magic deals. Here is the motive of a former suggestion that analysis should be so coordinated with magic as to comprise the first stage of development. For in climbing the tree, which is the formal expression to denote the realization of the Sephiroth from the bottom upwards, the first approached is the 9th, that principle of man which is called the Nefesh. That is to say, the next level of consciousness beneath the ordinary waking state of the active world is the level of dreams and lurid image and picture. It is the most superficial layer of the unconscious, using this term as the composite of the formative, creative, and archetypal levels of the tree of life. The formative world is that of the warring instincts and unconscious conflicts, the realm of the predatory lusts and passions. It is with this particular level that the analyst must deal in the majority of his patients in order to resolve those conflicts that have their existence in that plane. If there be conflict and incessant warfare here, how can the flow of spiritual energy descend from the higher Sephiroth, or, depending upon one's point of view, ascend from the deeper levels of consciousness? If the direct result of an unresolved conflict is to tie a knot, as it were, in the psyche, naturally there is no free passage for the libido, which is thus thwarted and frustrated. How can access be obtained to the more primitive, diviner parts of the psyche, those archaic levels of the unconscious whose nature is entirely spiritual, where function those principles which aspire to the superhuman, shining heights, if the channel be dammed and the way barred by conflict? If the message or revelations from these lofty heights are changed in nature and perverted by the presence within the mind of a powerful and ugly complex, how can there be real magic and spiritual development? Since analytical psychology confines itself by its own definition to an examination and a clarification of the 2 upper and most superficial levels of consciousness, this process must be considered the preliminary aspect of magical routine, where analysis preaches the gospel of re-education in the attitude towards life. And when we find psychological patients producing magical designs or mandalas of the type that Jung reproduces in The Secret of the Golden Flower, here we have an encroachment upon, or a usurpation of the realm and function of magic, and a transcending of the limitations of the ordinary analytical technique. Just as the technique of analysis must comprise the first stage of development, so to my mind the second stage is occupied by various elementary techniques of magic. I say elementary advisedly, for it is only these elementary techniques which the average Westerner may ever feel inclined to take upon himself, being debarred from more intense application to the magical art by such limitations, among other things, as time, the necessity for a business and domestic life, etc. The more advanced magical routines are for the exceptional person, and comprise the training of the human psyche to complete spiritual mastery. Splendid visions though this is, an ideal goal for the few, it is nevertheless outside the capacity of most of us who are obliged to live the ordinary life of the 20th century man or woman. The preliminary techniques we may consider under several headings, viz. 1. The Kabbalistic cross. 2. The lesser banishing ritual of the pentagram. 3. The formulation of the middle pillar and the tree of life and the sphere of sensation. 4. The methods of circumambulation and the vibratory formula of the middle pillar. 5. Ceremonial magic. For the moment, I shall content myself with presenting a bird's eye view of each, so that a picture of the entire scheme may be envisaged. The first method describes a formulation upon the body of a geometrical figure, the effect of which is designed to call out operation, the deepest levels of the unconscious. If I say at the outset that every technique of magic is intended in different ways to open the conscious ego's field of vision to the deeper, more spiritual aspects of the divine nature, there can be no possibility of misunderstanding. The procedure of the Kabbalistic cross is through the cultivation of a species of what is called in psychology the fantasy, of encouraging the imagination to build images, through which the power of the it may flow unimpeded. Though the most elementary, it is in reality one of the most important phases of the magical work, indispensable to the beginner. It is of just as much value to the more advanced student. It is an axiom of magic that is the divine will alone which is capable of conferring illumination and enlightenment, and so acting that every action of the ego has its correct place in the scheme of things. Thus it is that the Kabbalistic cross is the ideal means of placing the ego under the direct surveillance of the Yechidah, the divine will in every human being. It is an excellent method for rendering the conscious porous and susceptible to the dictates of the more responsible and humanitarian levels of the unconscious. The lesser banishing ritual of the pentagram, described as the second method, is the sequel to the former exercise. It is a technique designed to eliminate from the psychic sphere those interior elements which are undesirable. By an effort of the imagination, the student visualizes those qualities or conflicts or psychic lesions which are not required. By means of vibrating certain sonorous sounds called anciently divine names, whilst tracing certain lineal figures both in the air and within his imagination, he is enabled to project them from him. With the projection outwards and assisted by the increased flow of libido, they may be disintegrated by him. Other forces, archetypes of the deeper levels, are formulated and invoked to assist in so difficult a task. The entire ritual, properly performed, is one calculated to lead the student slowly but gradually towards the heights envisaged by the system. The most important routine method of spiritual development in the entire magical system is, in my estimation, the third exercise in my classification. If the student remembers the tree of life, he will see that the middle pillar is a series of 5 spheres arranged in a single upright column. The exercise proceeds by the visualization of these Sephiroth as circles or spheres of light in various significant parts of the physical body. More accurately, they are to be realized as centers already existent in the aura, which is for this purpose defined as an egg shape of subtle electric matter, a magnetic field which surrounds and interpenetrates the material body of man. The object of this visualization is to awaken these Sephiroth in balanced activity as a means of providing the higher genius, as the it may be named, with a psychic mechanism by which it may freely function within consciousness at the intent of the ego. It will be recalled as stated as an axiom that certain of the psychological principles of man have their correspondence with various organs and limbs and parts of the physical body. The exercise called the middle pillar is a demonstration of this axiom, given the attributions of these principles as a practical experiment to be attempted. The visualization of the Sephiroth and the measured vibration of the divine names arouses the centers of this aura, or sphere of sensation, from their former latent condition. The effect is gradually to bring into operation the dormant and hitherto unsuspected parts of the psyche. The result of this practice evinces, for one thing, an unparalleled level of vitality and power. This induces and is succeeded by a calmer judgment, less perturbable by the affairs of the external life, though the capacity for dealing with it remains unimpaired. It produces a solution to spiritual perplexity, bringing to an end the curse of indecisiveness, assisting the mind to a more responsive and open attitude to the dictates or intuitions of the higher self. At first, the middle pillar only receives attention, but as practice renders the student expert, even dexterous in manipulating his visualizations, he will find it worthwhile to lengthen the duration of the practice, increasing the field of his attention. Balance and equilibrium, brought within achievement by the formulation of the centers of the middle pillar, then the Sephiroth of the two side pillars of mercy and severity are added to the picture. Progress is bound to be slow and gradual here, but given patience and perseverance, a new sphere of power and spiritual perception will unfold itself. As a means of giving poise to neurotic patience and of assisting the task of analysis, the practice of the middle pillar may be recommended to psychologists. For by these means the conscious mind is rendered calm and still, the desirable condition to permit the ascent of the archetypes and inspiration of other levels of consciousness. During the period of attention to the middle pillar, dreams far more readily cross the threshold of consciousness, and as time proceeds, they seem very definitely to pertain to less superficial aspects of the psyche, to the regions which normally are very difficult to contact, the creative and archetypal worlds of the animus, the almost exclusive concern in the past of poets, mystics, and magicians. The fourth routine exercise, the vibratory formula, is fundamentally an extension of the middle pillar visualization. Its technique proceeds in a way similar to the earlier exercise, but here we confront a rationale of a different order. The theory here is that by awakening a power or level of consciousness within man's own sphere, it is possible to contact the corresponding force in the external world, or a similar level of perception and experience in the collective unconscious. Its intent is not only the development of the individual by rendering him conscious of his other principles, but to transform him into a willing vehicle and instrument of the universal mind, of that great and uniform substratum common to the whole of mankind. It is within the power of man, by these methods, to associate himself with the almost omnipotent vitality and spiritual value of those divine powers which as an aggregate comprise the universe. It is the first step towards what is colloquially termed adeptship, that path by which man is translated into a voluntary co-worker with nature in the task of evolution. The final exercise is magic proper, the art of ceremonial magic. By now it should be abundantly clear that not all magic is ceremonial, that not necessarily does it proceed by way of ceremony or ritual, nor does it always require the usual paraphernalia of robe, candle, incense, and lodge room. There is much in magic which is not too dissimilar with the methods of meditation. That is to say, it follows an interior route, and is a means of dealing with the psyche by way of the actual psychological instruments of psyche, without reference to any external object, symbol, or piece of equipment. It is the technique of an equilibrated introversion. Just as the exercises described above comprise the second stage of magic, as analysis is the first, so ceremonial magic, as a distinct method, is the third. I will iterate that charlatans and misguided enthusiasts have done only too much to confirm general opinion in the belief that magic is sheer quackery, but the earnest student who has applied faithfully these fundamental principles will, by his enriched nature, bear testimony to its value, both therapeutic and spiritual. Ceremonial magic has been misunderstood by overzealous beginners, principally because there has been no general understanding of the principles here laid down as rudiments of the work, Except in the rare cases of those born with a definite flair, it is quite impossible to succeed in ceremonial magic until a great deal of development has been obtained. And by development I imply the awakening or formulation within of the Sephiroth of the Tree of Life. Development implies the arousing of the dormant power of the psyche. Above all else, it means the ascent into consciousness of the light and love and wisdom of the higher genius, the Yechida. Until that light shines above and through the student, and the magical power is operative within, ceremony must remain for what it is for most people, a thing of habit and custom, a set of observances perfunctorily to be performed, celebrations in which there is no trace of virtue, of value, of power. The divine power, once awakened, and the light of the higher self pouring through the mind, then ceremony appears in its entirely different guise. It becomes a magical engine for the harnessing and directing of the power and consciousness of the psyche. Ceremony may be realized now as a means of mobilizing the hitherto unknown factors in man's constitution and employing them for various ends, which depend entirely on man himself and the extent of his knowledge and spiritual development. Here is no place to utter portentous warnings about the use and abuse of magical powers and spiritual knowledge. Within the psyche itself is a sentinel which never sleeps. It is a guardian of the moral law whose punishment is so dire and devastating that there is no appeal save by expiation of crime. From the dicta and judgments of this inner self there is no escape, except through the admission and the acceptance of the abuse, following by a grim determination forever to avoid a similar deed. Chapter 3. The Kabbalistic Cross and the Pentagram Ritual. Some years ago, the principles of this exercise of the Kabbalistic Cross were published in my book, The Tree of Life, and I repeat the rubric as follows. 1. Touch the forehead. Say, Ato, thou art. 2. Bring the hand down and touch the breast. Say, Malkuth, the kingdom. 3. Touch the left shoulder and say, Ve Gedula, and the glory. 4. Touch the right shoulder and say, Ve Guvera, and the power. 5. Clasping the fingers on the breast, say, Le Olam Amen, forever Amen. The words employed are in the Hebrew tongue. Hebrew is so employed because the magical system first attained prominence in Europe since it was adopted by some Jewish philosophers whom we call Kabbalists. Apart from this usage of Hebrew words, there is not the slightest implication of Hebrew theology or philosophy. The gestures themselves are a variance of the ordinary Christian cross, making use of the last few phrases of the Lord's Prayer. That it is utilized in magical work is due to the fact that it constitutes an ideal method of equilibrating the personality and raising the mind to the contemplation of higher things. The first name in the invocation is Ato. This is a Hebrew word meaning thou, and the second personal pronoun. To explain this in the simplest possible way, may I say that there is some justification in metaphysics for this usage. The reader who has studied some philosophy will have noted reference to a triad of concepts, such as the thinker, the thing known, and the act or the result of cognition. The ancient authorities of the Kabbalistic philosophy conceived that the deepest or most spiritual principle in man, which they argued was man's highest notion of divinity, was just such a triad of a thinker, knowledge, and the act of knowing. To each one of these principles or functions of the higher self, they therefore attributed a personal pronoun as a symbol. The thinker, the Yechida itself, manifestly was I. Thou was referred to the thing known, and the third person, he, was referred to the activity of the thinker, though all three were considered an indissoluble unity. But bearing in mind, at times, the concept of the middle way, by which the extremes of the opposites may be avoided, they chose as the word to express the higher self in this slight ritual the second pronoun, thou. The other words employed are the names of the Sephiroth on the Tree of Life. Gevura, or power, is that center numbered 5 on the diagram. Gedula, or mercy, is the 4th. These two are the centers represented by the 2 lodge room pillars and the 2 opposites encountered in everyday life. It is of these 2 centers that speaks the ritual injunction already quoted about unbalanced severity being cruelty and oppression. Malkuth is the 10th Sephirah. It is translated by the word kingdom, insomuch as the ancients considered that man's nature was a kingdom of inconceivable extent, a kingdom of vast and wide complexity, one having over it a divinely ordained ruler, the Yechida. The last phrase of the ritual is of little significance, save as it completes the gesture. The word olam means forever, but it can also mean world or universe. We would assume that it is so placed as a peroration because within the miniature universe which is man, there are innumerable elements and principles in constant activity, the entire 10 Sephiroth of the Tree of Life. If the reader will bear these brief explanations in mind, the description of the rubric which follows will be seen to have more significance than otherwise might be the case. Ato is a reference to the higher genius, the it. Malkuth refers to the body. This is with the Yechida being the dual expression of the living human organism, the 2 expressions of the yang and the yin, using these latter terms in their widest connotation. Gevura and Gedula, the 2 extremes of power as the highest aspects of the ego, signify the 2 modes of that ego's capacity for action and reaction. The final gesture, closing on a point which is between these 2 extremes, indicates the voluntary decision of the evolving psyche to seek a balanced position, the middle way, a place which partakes of both the opposites and yet which is not subject to their equal but opposing poles. It has been emphasized that the fundamental task of both analytical psychology and magic is to attempt to bring into operation the higher genius, or to bring into full working consciousness the content of the hidden and buried unconsciousness. We should remember the parables of the archaic philosophical religions, whose fundamental tenet was that within man was a spirit, a dynamic center of consciousness, which, because of its contact and association with matter, has been plunged into a profound sleep, a state of somnambulism. The problem is, how may this slumbering level of the primeval consciousness be awakened within us? By endeavoring to extend the horizon of consciousness, to enlarge the field of awareness so as to embrace what previously was unconscious, is obviously a logical method. To become aware of all of our actions, our thoughts and emotions, and unsuspected motives, to regard them in their true light, as actually they are, and not as we would like them to be, or as we would wish the onlooker to perceive them. It requires, to take this step, an extraordinary degree of honesty and courage, both indispensable virtues to the student of psychology and magic. The more of this suppressed and forgotten material stored in this at one time unknown or dormant side of our nature that can be raised into the clear light of the day, by exactly so much do we awake from that inert stupor into which we have in the past been plunged. And also, by that much do we liberate ourselves from the compulsion to nature's instinctual commands, and become freed from what Levi Bruhl has called the participation mystique. It is a phrase coined to express that peculiar unity with nature with which primitive man felt and enjoyed, that participation in the unconsciousness of nature which only became disrupted as the evolution of mind made itself apparent, a slinking serpent within the peaceful Garden of Eden. But mankind, despite thousands of years of evolution, has not yet freed itself as a whole from this subjection to the unconsciousness of nature, whereby it moves and feels without deliberation and without conscious volition. Here and there we do find an individual who has realized the snare and burden in which he has lived, and attempted accordingly to release himself from the bonds in which he has been bound. Any system, therefore, which recognizes these deep unconscious levels of awareness and vitality, insisting moreover upon that recognition, assists in the evolution of mankind. The Kabbalistic cross, so called, considered as a preamble to more serious and difficult work, indicates just this awareness of other levels of consciousness, and the necessity of bringing them into operation within the human psyche. Not only so, but it recognizes that these newly awakened levels of power and consciousness may be deeply disturbing to the novice who attempts this voyage of discovery. Therefore, what is essential is that not only should they be awakened, but that they should be recognized and equilibrated in a balanced disposition. This also, it is the object of the Kabbalistic cross to accomplish. One more word before proceeding to a description of the technique of its performance. The tradition holds that these words should be vibrated and not merely enunciated. That is to say, the student must discover for himself that method of humming or pronouncing these words which will assist in the production of a vibration. Some find that these words uttered in a shrill voice is best adapted to their requirements. Others, including the present writer, have found through experiment and frequent test that a moderately deep pitch, slightly higher than the ordinary speaking voice, is most suited to produce the desired vibration. Each syllable shall be evenly vibrated, no one being accented at the expense of another. The test of the vibration, strange though it may seem, is that it should denote in the palms of the hands and the soles of the feet. When vibrating a word forcibly, but not necessarily loudly, a tingling sense should be felt in every cell and nerve of the body, and it should seem particularly that in the hands and feet every atom and cell has become alive and is in a state of rapid vibration. Little more than this can be said in explanation without actual demonstration, but it is such a simple matter in which to attain proficiency that no difficulty should be experienced. The metaphysical theory involved here is that by means of vibration, the actual formation of the body-mind system may be changed and renewed. That is to say, the proponents of the system urge for a consideration of the fact that within a period of 7 years, the body has undergone a complete biological change, and during that time has renewed its entire cell structure. It has ejected old and deceased organisms, and by means of the metabolic process has built itself a new cell organization. The vibratory technique, therefore, hastens the expulsion of dead tissue and unwanted molecules and particles, so that new ones being absorbed into the system, whilst attention is devoted to expanding the field of consciousness, a purified body is produced, through which that higher consciousness may more readily function. It is principally a question of tactics. One could, on one hand, content oneself solely with the task of widening the field of consciousness, altogether to the exclusion of bringing the body system within the scope of this purifying process. Or, on the other hand, the entire time and attention could be given solely to the production of certain obscure bodily changes, as do some Oriental Hatha yogis, to the exclusion and at the expense of desirable factors of consciousness. Magic, very sanely, combines the advantages of both points of view, eliminating the dangerous and harmful features common to the other. Always in a salutary way is the path between the two extremes indicated. When actually performing the Kabbalistic cross, it is well to face the east, the place of the rising of the sun. This takes advantage of a prevailing symbolism which identifies Yechida with enlightenment and wisdom, a spiritual concept always determined by and defined in terms of light. It is from the east that the light arises. Standing motionless, with the eyes closed, should that render the act of reflection easier, endeavor to contemplate the nature of the Yechida, that is by definition the quintessence of life, light, love, and liberty, and that these are the qualities of the essence of mind which is intrinsically pure. One very essential point constantly requiring recollection is that in the magical symbolism, as well as in that of psychology, has been demonstrated, the various psychic principles have a spatial correlative in the human body. That is, certain principles correspond to or have a special affinity with certain organs or limbs of the body. This certainly is a fact within everybody's experience. Emotion is almost always associated with the heart, reason with the head, passion with the genitals. The magical tradition simply classifies and considerably extends this list of affinities. Whilst considering the Yechida, recognizing that it represents freedom and that its nature is light itself, the student should endeavor to visualize just above the crown of his head a spherical form of light. The diagram on page 73, see figure 4, will indicate its likely position. The symbolism places this above the head because, in the first place, since the Yechida is the root of man's consciousness, it is a principle of whose presence the majority of us have never become really aware. That is not to deny its existence, but only to affirm our previous ignorance. Moreover, magical symbolism, which incidentally is of the same type that employed by the unconscious, also affirms that this divine genius, being the highest principle within of which we still have no awareness, has not yet fully incarnated within us. That is to say, it is a potency which overshadows us, a principle which the race will be able to realize fully only some thousands of generations hence. The consensus of experienced opinion has it, therefore, that this overshadowing, no matter whether actual or only metaphorical, does assuredly exist, and that the psychic correlative of an overshadowing is a center just above the crown of the head. Fantastic this certainly may sound at first, but I cannot make any attempt to justify it or defend it. And were I called before a tribunal of intellectual criticism, I would only recommend that the practice be followed as a definite scientific experiment, and the results experienced. Let therefore the student consider his higher and divine genius, the core of his unconscious, as of the nature of wisdom and love and light, visualizing its sphere of activity as having an affinity with the region immediately above the head. After some seconds of this quiet recollection, let him raise his hand above his head, then lower it to the forehead and vibrate the first word, Ato, as though formally to affirm the presence of that genius. The hand employed should then be brought in a straight line down to the region about the diaphragm. Vibrate the word Malkuth. As this is done, let the mind dwell on the fact that as the hand descends, so does a stream of light descend from above, a steady brilliant ray of light permeating him through and through. A shaft of light is therefore formed, which extends from the crown of his head to the soles of his feet. Strictly speaking, Malkuth, the last Sephirah, is referred to the feet. For convenience's sake, however, we touch the breast or solar plexus with the mental recognition that it is the region of the feet that actually we have reference to and to which the shaft of light is directed. This forms the first half of the exercise. Some seconds pause should take place here in order to visualize and feel as strongly as is possible the presence of a brilliant ray of light. Then, shifting the attention from the central pillar of light to the left shoulder, let the student consider that here is a reservoir of enormous power, and vibrate the word Vegedula. A ray of light should be commenced here in the imagination, and visualized to penetrate the breast until it reaches the right shoulder, when the remaining word, Vegevura, is vibrated. Thus is formulated the horizontal shaft or the crossbar of this cross of light. The first gesture traced a light beam from head to foot, while the second one traced the ray from shoulder to shoulder, interlocking the fingers on the breast and vibrating the final word, Le'olam Amen. The student should endeavor to see a cross of light actually standing within him. None but very few may hope at once to succeed in feeling this, in obtaining the pulsing sensation of a cross of light vibrating within. It will require persistent and regular exercise before this sensation makes itself apparent. It is a significant development, marking a definite stage in growth. Some little preliminary practice in the art of visualization may be necessary, as well as in acquiring the ability of giving utterance to the names so that the sound appears to vibrate in a given spot. When this is acquired, a name can be vibrated in the head, the palms of the hand, in thighs or feet, or elsewhere at will. As skill is obtained, the sense of the cross of light becomes marked and definite. The opening practice can be extended. That is to say, prior to visualizing the center of light above the head, the student should endeavor to expand the sphere of his consciousness. By this, it is meant that he should try to imagine with eyes closed that the body grows and grows until the height increases enormously. Let him formulate in his own mind that the physical form heightens to such an extent that the head gradually touches the ceiling, goes through the roof, and finally, that the semblance of a vast figure with head in the clouds of space is obtained, the feet resting securely on earth. In fact, from this exalted point of view, the earth seems but a small globe beneath the feet. Having obtained this sense of expansion, and it may be accompanied by a heightened sense of consciousness or ecstasy, then let him visualize during the first vibration that the ray of light descends from the heavens upon his head, penetrating him and eventually illuminating the region of his feet, which are set firmly upon the earth. The sense of expansion is a definite one, rendering the performance of the gestures of the Kabbalistic cross as much more vital and significant experience. The reasons given for the necessity of this astral expansion lies in the fact that the ancient mystical systems hold that the transcendental nature of man, the essence of mind, is infinite in nature, a positive void of which no quality can be predicated. As one Eastern scripture puts it, learned audience, the illimitable void of the universe is capable of holding myriads of things of various shapes and forms, such as the sun, the moon, the stars, mountains, etc. Space takes in all these, and so does the voidness of our nature. We say that the essence of mind is great because it embraces all things, since all things are within our nature. The instruction to expand consciousness, or to formulate the astral form as of gigantic proportions, standing solitary in space, containing within itself all the forces and worlds of the entire universe, is a literal fulfillment of the above metaphysical postulate. Likewise, in some of the few Hermetic fragments that we inherit, there is similar advice. In fact, it states the technical process so excellently that I am moved to reproduce it here. Increase thyself to immeasurable height, leaping clear of all body, and surmounting all time. Become eternal, and thou shalt know God. There is nothing impossible to thyself. Deem thyself immortal, and able to do all things. become higher than all height and lower than all depth, to be everything at the same time in earth and sea and heaven. Think that thou art as yet begotten, that thou art in the womb, that thou art young, that thou art old, that thou hast died and art beyond to death. Perceive all these things together, and thou shalt know God. But if thou shuttest up thy soul in thy body, and abasest thyself, and sayest, I know nothing, I can do nothing, I am afraid of earth and sea, I cannot mount to heaven, I know not what I was or what I shall be, then what hast thou to do with God? Corpus Hermeticum 11. Something of the sort can be seen in the writings of Plotinus. In any event, metaphysical or psychological or nonsense, only constant practice will determine whether it has validity and value, or whether these are simply delusions of unbalanced minds. The final test must be a pragmatic test. It is that of science itself. It will now be seen why it was stated above that this practice is essential to all magical work. In fact, it should precede or form part of any series of mental exercises upon which one may embark, insomuch as it does endeavor to ally the personality with the true sources of life, permitting them in any event a species of open channel to enter into consciousness. No words can underestimate or exaggerate its importance. This is not to suppose that at once will the casual performer of the Kabbalistic cross become aware of the secret self of the unconscious, the flame which burns in the core of every man. That is simply not the implication, for he who runs may not read. What is implied is that continuation in the way of regular practice brings with it a recognition of the transcendental self, or, to put it another way, a bridge is formulated between the conscious and the unconscious, permitting the mind to be made porous to diviner things. Gradually and almost imperceptibly, the student will become aware of the inspiration of that higher genius. The principal error on the part of earlier writers on magic, and my earlier literary efforts are also included within the scope of these strictures, was that constantly they spoke of ecstasy and divine illumination, and transports of spiritual delight. These experiences may be true of the more advanced or evolved student. For the average individual, they can have but little meaning. What actually does occur is that there is a gradual connecting up of one level of consciousness with another. This links on to another and so forth, until finally the everyday waking consciousness becomes permeated with an awareness of divine creative faculties, which have fertilized its intolerable barrenness. This awareness marks the end of that interior sense of sterility and frustration. Here we have, in a word, the rationale of such mystical phraseology as union with God, the spiritual marriage, alchemical nuptials, etc. There is, to state it differently, a gradual engaging of the clutch. By this method there is no violent grinding of gears. There is only an imperceptible and slow changeover to another speed, or rate of vibration, as it is called, to another mode of functioning. The everyday wake-a-world consciousness becomes more refined and sensitive, aware of new possibilities, displaying an understanding of and an insight into life and experience which it never had before. A wide tolerance is developed, and an all-inclusive sympathy for and concern in man's problems is manifested where formerly there was self-centeredness and disinterestedness in anything that did not touch upon personal problems. There are tests, experimental facts open to all, facts which are of value only to him in whom that insight awakes by dint of persistent effort, for no one else has it the least validity. The Kabbalistic cross provides the preamble as well as their peroration to another exercise. This is named the lesser banishing ritual of the pentagram. The rubric of it as follows. 1. Perform the Kabbalistic cross. 2. Face east. Stretch out right hand holding a dagger. Trace a banishing earth pentagram. Vibrate the word Yod He Vav He, spelled YHVH. 3. Still holding out hand and dagger, turn to the south. Trace another pentagram in precisely the same way and vibrate the word Adonai, spelled ADNI. 4. Then turn to the west and trace pentagram. Vibrate Ihye, spelled AHIH. 5. Turn north, trace pentagram and vibrate Agela, spelled AGLA. 6. Return to the east, extend arms in the form of cross. 7. Say, before me, Raphael. 8. Behind me, Gabriel. 9. On my right hand, Michael. 10. On my left hand, Ariel. 11. For before me flames the pentagram. 12. And behind me shines the six-rayed star. 13. Repeat the Kabbalistic cross. The function of this ritual, though capable of extension in several other directions, is preeminently one of banishment. Its aim is to eliminate from the sphere of the mind those qualities or sensations which the critical ego deems unnecessary. Its rationale is that a system of vibration may act upon the human organism in a purifying and strengthening way. Every molecule, every cell, astral, mental, and physical, is affected by this ritual, since the basis of every psychophysical activity of man is grounded in these centers of energy and spiritual force. These microscopic points, or monads, are the minute sensitive points of spiritual consciousness, each of them a yechida, or it, to its own particular system or small universe. In the reality of their existence and function is based the deepest sense of man's individuality and the basis of matter also. Mind and body are not two separate things, but dual manifestations of one and the same unknown unit. The result of the celebration of the Kabbalistic cross, the vibration of the divine names, the formulation of the 4 pentagrams, and the invocation of archangelic forms in the 4 quarters, is that gradually coarser elements are ejected from the sphere of sensation. To take their place, other particles, more sensitive and refined, of a higher grade of spiritual substance, are attracted to the personal sphere and become infused into the character and nature of the physical and psychological constitution. The nature of these newly acquired particles is such as not to impede the free flow of libido or of power and inspiration from the underlying levels of the unconscious to the superficial awareness of man. In this way, a very real purification takes place, enabling the influence of the higher genius to penetrate the refined and porous brain, to diffuse throughout the personality a more profound insight and a keener zest and appreciation of life, and it bestows a greater ability to cope with it. The ritual itself is not a simple movement, but is composed of several phrases. The first is that of the Kabbalistic cross, already explained. The second consists of the tracing of a limiting circle, marked at each of the 4 angles, or cardinal quarters, by a pentagram. Third, the invocation of the archangelic guardians. Fourth, the repetition of the opening gesture. Having expanded consciousness and visualized himself as a towering cross of light, let the student face the east of his room, stretching before him his right hand. It is customary to employ a straight-bladed dagger with a cross hilt, but this is relatively unimportant for the novice, the fingers alone being quite adequate to the work. To trace the pentagram, bring the outstretched arm over to the left side, to a point in front corresponding to just about the middle of the thigh. Move the arm upwards to a point which would correspond to the top of the head. Descend on the right to about the middle of the right thigh. The movement will have traced a large inverted V about 3 feet high. Move the outstretched arm over towards the left to slightly above the shoulder, then carry it horizontally to a point just above the right shoulder, and then diagonally downwards to the point originally started from. Difficult and complex it may sound, but in practice it is very easy. If a 5-pointed star is drawn on paper, it will be seen at a glance what the import of the above directions are. They have been delineated at length above because, incredible as it seems, the writer has found some individuals performing the most outrageous gestures in the belief that they were tracing pentagrams. The only point is to remember to make a fairly large figure, about 3 feet high, and above all, that it should be a well-proportioned pentagram, and not a deformed or eccentric one. Some little practice may be required to achieve this, especially in making the final diagonal so as to complete the gesture exactly where the initial ascending line began. This is all straightforward enough, but this is the mere physical aspects of this exercise. In practice, something more is demanded of the practitioner. While tracing these pentagrams with his arm outstretched, his visualizing faculty must be active and alert. He must endeavor to imagine these 4 pentagrams as flaming figures of a bluish gold hue similar to that produced by igniting methylated spirit. After completing the physical tracing of the figure, he should be able to perceive by the mind's eye, with the eyes closed, the pentagrams flaming quite vividly in front of him. Naturally, this requires much practice, and save for him whose faculty of visualization is already very well developed, it is, unfortunately, a faculty not easily come by. Only exertion and continual practice will develop this. Thus, the first stage of the ritual is the visualization of the pentagram, while actually tracing it with finger or dagger. While the commencing point of each pentagram has been returned to, let the student pause and, imagining a central point in that figure, bring up his arm to that center, stabbing or charging it energetically with outstretched dagger. It is at this juncture that the divine name should be vibrated, slowly and evenly. It suffices to vibrate each name but once. Each of these 4 names associated with the pentagram in a different cardinal quarter has to be vibrated in precisely the same way as was directed for those names connected with the Kabbalistic cross. It should be endeavored to feel them operating within. Also visualize that as they are vibrated, the power of the name travels out through the pentagram's center to the end of that particular cardinal quarter. This procedure is to be followed in each quarter, the only variation being the different name employed. It will be noted that each of these names is comprised of 4 letters each. In the mystical system of the ancients, each was attributed to one of the 4 elements or the 4 nodes of activity comprising our makeup, and the ritual has direct effect upon these. It would take too long and serve no good purpose to dilate upon the reason why these names were supposed to be effectual, and why certain names were associated with certain quarters and not to others. Suffice here to say that the tradition has found them effectual for the purpose under consideration, and the experimental work of modern students has confirmed the psychological association. the student desirous of delving more deeply into the subject, wishing to discover the system by which symbolic names are attributed to certain quarters or to the 10 Sephiroth, will find much material in The Tree of Life and My Rosicrucian Adventure, as well as in The Golden Dawn. The last pentagram having been traced in the north, the student returns, still holding arm with dagger outstretched, to the east where he started from, with his arms extended to form a cross, and being aware about him of the 4 pentagrams vitalized by the vibration, he now commences a further phase of the ritual. Here is demanded of him the visualization of the vast archangelic figures standing behind each pentagram, as though the latter were a sort of flaming shield supported by those magical or talismanic images. Some words or two are needed to be expressed about archangels and angels. Most readers, unfamiliar with the nomenclature and general tenets of the magical philosophy, may feel inclined to balk at this juncture. The postulate, however, is quite a logical one, for the philosophy of magic conceives of one root source from which all life sprang, one fundamental life current, infinite and omnipresent, expressing itself in diverse ways. This we can call, if we wish, God, libido, the collective unconscious, depending upon what system of religion or metaphysic we subscribe to. Within this universal life are archetypal images, nodal points which act as termini or power stations, through which, as it were, the root life stream flows and is diluted or transmuted so as to be assimilable or available to a lower form of life. These primordial archetypes of the collective unconscious are the psychic forms into which repeated ancestral experiences have molded the typically human mode of apprehension. Generally speaking, these primordial archetypes, man's first definition of the manifold forces of nature, comprise what in magic were meant by gods and archangels and angels. One very clever expositor, referring to the manner in which the ancient magicians conceived of these archetypes, or magical images, expressed the idea thus: they took each factor in nature and personified it, gave it a name, and built up a symbolic figure to represent it, just as British artists have, by their collective efforts, produced a standard Britannia, a female figure with shield charged with the Union Jack, a lion at her feet, a trident in her hand, a helmet on her head, the sea in the background. Analyzing this figure as we would a Kabbalistic symbol, we realize that these individual symbols in the complex glyph have each a significance. In fact, an occult glyph is more akin to a coat of arms than anything else. A magical figure is the coat of arms it represents. These magical figures are built up to represent the different modes of the manifestation of cosmic force in its different types and on its different levels. They are given names, and the initiate thinks of them as persons, not troubling himself about their metaphysical foundations. An angelic being, then, may be defined as a cosmic force whose apparent vehicle of manifestation to psychic consciousness is a form built up by the human imagination. When facing east, therefore, and vibrating powerfully the name Raphael, the student should attempt to build up in his imagination or to visualize a vast angelic figure, conceived of in the traditional conventional style of vibrating yellow and mauve hues. The whole figure, the visualization complete, will be gracious and slight and airy, and the mauve, which touches up and brings out the vivid pale yellow, will cause the robes to flash and shimmer, giving the impression of shot silk. It may also appear that a gentle breeze is wafting wafted from behind the figure. In the south, the archangelic form to be imagined will have a predominance of flaming red, touched here and there by vivid flashes of emerald green. In the hand of the figure will be seen an uplifted sword of steel, while little tongues of fire will lick the browned earth about the bare feet. An intense radiation of heat should be sensed from Michael. Watery characteristics will mark the name of Gabriel in the west, and blue offset by orange will be its color. A blue chalice of water will be held aloft by the talismanic figure, which will sometimes seem as though it were standing in a rushing stream of clearest water. Sometimes it may seem as though there were a small waterfall behind the figure, pouring cascades of water into the temple or room. In the north, the angel Auriel will appear to be standing on a very fertile ground, grasses and wheat being about the feet. Sheaves of corn will be held in both the outstretched hands, and on the whole, the prevailing colors will be a mixture of citrine, olive, russet, and some little black. The technique of here employing these talismanic or magical figures of the archangels, once the appropriate names have been vibrated and some realization obtained of the presence of the correct type of spiritual power flowing through the figure, is to imagine that the emanation from the archangel penetrates and cleanses the personality. That is to say, in the east from behind the archangel Raphael should be felt a gentle wind or breeze which, permeating the entire body, blows from it every trace of impurity. From Michael in the south, warmth at first of gentle degree should be felt, increasing in intensity to a powerful heat which burns and utterly consumes every blemish which troubled the personality. This purging should be felt as consecrating one to the service of the higher self. The same technique should be applied to Gabriel in the west, except that one is purified with water, while in the north one is invested with the stability and fertility of Auriel, archangel of the earth. Of course, this sounds a most complex and complicated procedure to pursue, but with practice, the entire exercise will be found to be easy. First of all, the student should recognize that a wise man knows how to limit himself. He will limit himself at the start to obtaining mastery of the mechanical part of the ritual without reference to the initiated technique. That is to say, his aim should be to commit the ritual to memory so completely that at any particular quarter there is no groping for the appropriate names. Then each phase should be studied separately until skill and ease are achieved. He should apply himself to familiarizing himself with the sense of expansion of consciousness and visualizing the descending ray of light which formulates itself into a vast radiant cross within him. A certain degree of accomplishment gained in this exercise, and already being skilled in the tracing of perfectly geometrical pentagrams in midair, the next task is to obtain about him a clear formulation of the blazing pentagrams, vivified by the vibration of the appropriate divine names being hurled through them. Application to the technique of purification by means of again expanding consciousness whilst surrounding himself with the colossal magical figures of the archangels comprises the next important step. The final task is to visualize, before performing the Kabbalistic cross again, a pentagram of fire burning on the breast. Seen on the back is a hexagram, its ascending triangle being red in color, its descending triangle of blue, both triangles to be interlaced. I hope the student will not be frightened by this mass of directions, for he can be assured that the exercise is not nearly as obscure or terrifying as it sounds. Practice will make perfect, and the realization of the goal to be acquired will provide sufficient confidence to enable him to pursue the practice still further until complete mastery is achieved. In this way, his mind being made quiescent, and his body and emotional apparatus purified, the consciousness of the hidden grades or levels of his being may gently and gradually ascend and manifest to his perceptions, thus assisting him in his inward growth, in the conquest of ignorance and the acquisition of self-knowledge. Before closing this chapter, one final set of directions remains to be communicated with regard to this practice. Once skill has been acquired in performing accurately and effectually this lesser banishing ritual of the pentagram, the student may endeavor to perform the entire ritual in his mind. Seating himself comfortably in his chair, facing east, he should endeavor, without so much as rising or without any audible vibration of the words, to expand the form of his sphere of sensation and bring down the light of the higher self upon him. He ought to be able to imagine himself as standing, moving forward to the east, and tracing the pentagrams without moving the physical arm, silently or mentally vibrating the appropriate magical words. Likewise with the archangels. The more determined effort to visualize them and mentally pronounce their names will help call upon the figures and evoke the type of force which should flow through them. My sole caution is against attempting what obviously is an advanced practice until literally months have been spent working away at the physical performance of this exercise. The writer knew some people who neglected to take this piece of sound advice. Their work became very careless and slapdash, and whatever advantage was to be obtained from the ritual was never forthcoming.